They were drinking $3,000 champagne to celebrate a corporate empire while I was staring at a piece of paper that said I owed nearly $500,000 to an illegal gambling syndicate. When I tried to tell my wife and her family that the debt was completely fake, they did not listen. Instead, they dragged me out the front door, tossed my suitcase onto the wet pavement, and called me a degenerate. But the debt was a calculated lie, and the people standing on the porch laughing at my misery had no idea that my lawyer was carrying the one document that would tear their entire world apart. The nightmare began precisely at 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. We were gathered in the formal dining room of my in-law's sprawling estate. The room was practically a monument to the Sterling family wealth, filled with imported rugs, antique oil paintings, and a massive mahogany table that could easily seat 20 people. I was sitting near the end of that table, wearing a simple button-down shirt, feeling as invisible as I always did in their presence. At the head of the table sat Richard and Diane Sterling. They were country club elite, the kind of people who judged your entire existence by the logo on your watch and the zip code of your home. To their right was Trent, my wife, Victoria's older brother. Trent was the golden child of the Sterling family. He was a wealthy corporate developer with a slick smile and a cruel sense of humor. That afternoon, Trent was the center of the universe. He had just closed a massive corporate merger, and he was celebrating by popping a bottle of champagne that cost more than my first car. The cork flew across the room, hitting the vaulted ceiling, and Trent poured the sparkling liquid into crystal flutes. He handed a glass to his father, then his mother, and then to Victoria. He intentionally skipped me, leaving my water glass untouched. I was 38 years old. I worked as a mid-level regional supply chain manager. It was an honest living. I worked hard, I paid my taxes, and I provided a stable life. But to the Sterlings, I was nothing more than a peasant who had somehow tricked their daughter into marriage. They considered me unambitious, ordinary, and entirely unworthy of their family name. I had spent 10 years trying to earn their respect, swallowing my pride at every family gathering, enduring Trent's passive-aggressive jokes just to keep the peace for Victoria. But that day, Victoria was not acting like my partner. She sat stiffly in her chair, staring straight ahead. She did not touch her champagne. She did not look at me. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating, like the moments right before a violent storm breaks. Trent raised his glass high. He looked directly at me with a smirk that made my stomach turn. He proposed a toast to success, to vision, and to cutting dead weight loose. Richard and Diane laughed, clinking their glasses together. Before the crystal even stopped ringing, Victoria stood up. She reached down to the floor beside her chair and lifted a thick, heavy manila folder. She did not say a word as she walked over to my side of the table. Her face was a mask of pure ice. The woman I had loved for a decade, the woman I had built a home with, looked at me as if I were a stranger who had just broken into her house. She slammed the folder down onto the mahogany wood directly in front of my plate. The sound echoed through the large dining room, instantly silencing the laughter and the celebration. I looked up at her, entirely confused. I asked her what this was. Victoria crossed her arms over her chest. Her voice was flat and clinical, stripped of any emotion. She told me to open it. My hands were trembling slightly as I reached for the cover. I flipped it open, and the first thing I saw was a bank statement. But it was not from our joint checking account or our modest savings. It was a document bearing the logo of an offshore financial institution I had never heard of. There were columns of numbers, wire transfer records, and transaction histories, and at the bottom of the front page, printed in bold red ink, was a negative balance. $450,000. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at the number, trying to make sense of it. I flipped to the next page. It was a collection notice. It detailed a massive series of bets placed on the 2026 World Cup through an illegal high-stakes gambling syndicate. The documents claimed that I had been funneling money out of various accounts for months, chasing losses, borrowing from loan sharks, and racking up nearly $500,000 in toxic debt. I looked up at Victoria, my mind spinning. I told her this was insane. I told her I do not even watch soccer. I have never placed a sports bet in my entire life. I buy a lottery ticket maybe twice a year. I pleaded with her, telling her this had to be identity theft, a terrible mistake, or some kind of elaborate scam. But Victoria did not blink. She looked down at me with absolute disgust. She said I was a liar. She said she had hired a private investigator to dig into our finances because she had suspected I was hiding something for months. She claimed the investigator found this offshore account directly linked to my name, my social security number, and my personal email address. Before I could even process the absolute absurdity of her claims, Richard Sterling slammed his fists onto the table. The crystal glasses rattled. His face was flushed, dark red with fury. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. Richard shouted that he always knew I was a fraud. He said he warned Victoria on our wedding day that I was nothing but a parasite looking to leech off their family wealth. He called me a degenerate gambler, a pathetic excuse for a man who could not even provide for his own household without resorting to criminal behavior. Diane chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. She clutched the pearl necklace around her throat and sneered. She said I was filthy. She said I had brought shame and danger into their pristine lives. She accused me of putting her daughter in physical danger by dealing with underground syndicates. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. I was fighting for my life, fighting for my reputation, fighting for the truth. I looked at Trent, hoping for a moment of reason, but Trent was simply leaning back in his chair, swirling his expensive champagne, smiling like he was watching a highly entertaining movie. I turned back to Victoria. I begged her to listen to me. I told her to call the bank right now. I told her to call the police. If someone had stolen my identity to run up $500,000 in gambling debts, we needed the authorities. We needed a lawyer. Victoria took a step back as if my very presence repulsed her. She said she already had a lawyer. She reached into the folder and pulled out a second stack of papers. These were completely different. They were legal documents, petitions, court filings. Victoria looked me dead in the eyes and delivered the final blow. She announced that she was filing for an emergency divorce. She said my gambling addiction, my reckless financial behavior, and the immense debt I had secretly accumulated constituted grounds for immediate separation and asset forfeiture. She told me she was taking the house, the cars, and every penny in our legitimate accounts to protect herself from the creditors I had allegedly unleashed upon our family. My breath caught in my throat. I felt like I had been violently shoved out of a moving vehicle. This was not a discussion. This was an execution. She had already tried, convicted, and sentenced me without asking me a single question. I reached for the divorce papers, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the pages. I told her she could not do this. We had been married for 10 years. We built a life together. I swore on my own life that I had never made a single bet. Trent finally stood up. He walked slowly around the table, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the floor. He stopped right in front of me, invading my personal space. He looked down his nose at me. Trent told me I was out of time. He said I was a coward and a thief, and that I was lucky the Sterling family was simply throwing me out instead of having me thrown into a federal prison. He told me to put the papers down, turn around, and walk out the front door before he called the police and had me arrested for fraud. I refused to move. I looked at Victoria, pleading with my eyes. I asked her how she could throw away 10 years of marriage over a stack of forged papers. I asked her how she could believe a private investigator over the man who had slept beside her every night, who had worked endless hours to give her the life she wanted. Victoria did not even flinch. She simply turned her back to me and walked over to her mother. That was when I knew. The coldness in her eyes was not the shock of a betrayed wife. It was the calculated calm of a woman executing a plan. Richard and Trent did not give me another moment to think. Richard grabbed my left arm, his fingers digging painfully into my bicep. Trent grabbed my right shoulder. I was stunned, disoriented, and emotionally shattered. I tried to pull away, demanding they take their hands off me. I shouted that I was not leaving without answers, but I was outnumbered and my mind was too paralyzed by the betrayal to fight back properly. They physically forced me out of the dining room. They dragged me through the grand hallway of the estate, past the expensive artwork and the glittering chandeliers. I was shouting for Victoria, begging her to stop this insanity. but the house remained entirely silent except for the sounds of our struggle. They dragged me all the way to the massive double oak front doors. Trent yanked the door open. A brutal, freezing thunderstorm was raging outside. The wind howled and heavy sheets of rain lashed against the marble porch. I stumbled forward as they shoved me out into the cold. I barely caught my balance before I realized something else was waiting for me on the porch. It was my large black suitcase. I stared at it, the rain instantly soaking through my thin button-down shirt. The suitcase was zipped tight. It was heavy. It was packed. Victoria had not just discovered this alleged debt today. She had not confronted me in a moment of panic. She had calmly packed my clothes, my toiletries, and my personal belongings before I even arrived for Sunday dinner. This entire confrontation was a theatrical performance designed to humiliate me in front of her family and secure her narrative as the innocent victim. Richard stood in the doorway, his face twisted in a sneer. He told me to take my garbage and get off his property before he unleashed the dogs. Trent stepped up beside his father. He laughed, a cold, hollow sound that cut through the noise of the thunderstorm. He told me to enjoy the streets because a man with $500,000 in syndicate debt would not survive the week. They slammed the heavy oak doors shut. The sound of the deadbolt locking echoed with terrible finality. I was completely alone in the pouring rain. I stood there shivering, the icy water plastering my hair to my forehead and soaking my clothes through to the skin. My mind was a chaotic blur of grief, confusion, and rising panic. I had walked into that house an hour ago as a husband, with a job, a home, and a life. Now I was a homeless outcast accused of a massive crime I did not commit, facing an emergency divorce that would strip me of everything I owned. I fell to my knees on the hard, wet marble of the porch. I grabbed my suitcase, but as I did, I noticed a few loose papers sticking out from the front pocket. In their haste to pack my things and throw me out, someone had shoved a copy of the gambling syndicate loan documents into the bag. The rain was beating down on the paper, causing the ink to bleed, but I pulled the document out anyway. I stared at the numbers, the offshore account details, the massive deficit. I needed to understand how they had framed me. I needed to see what evidence they had manufactured to destroy my life so thoroughly. I flipped to the second page, shielding the paper from the heavy rain with my chest. I scanned the terms of the syndicate loan, the dates of the alleged wire transfers, and the signatures required to open the massive line of credit. There was my signature expertly forged at the bottom of the page. It looked exactly like my handwriting. Whoever did this had access to my personal documents. They had studied my signature perfectly, but as my eyes moved to the very bottom right corner of the wet paper, my heart stopped beating completely. The breath was knocked out of my lungs, leaving me gasping in the freezing storm. Right next to my forged signature on the line designated for the financial guarantor was a second signature. It was not forged. It was distinct, elegant, and entirely authentic. I had seen that exact handwriting on birthday cards, mortgage papers, and our marriage certificate. It was Victoria's signature. She was listed as the legal co-signer on the massive syndicate loan. The pieces of the nightmare suddenly snapped into sharp, horrifying focus. Victoria had not hired a private investigator to uncover my secrets. She was not a victim who had just discovered her husband was a gambling addict. Victoria was the one who opened the account. Victoria was the one who manufactured the debt. She had signed the loan documents herself. I was not just being framed by a faceless criminal. I was being set up, executed, and discarded by my own wife. And as I knelt in the freezing rain, clutching the wet paper that held the key to my destruction, I realized this was not just about a divorce. This was a calculated trap, and I had just walked right into it. The freezing rain felt like glass hitting my skin as I pulled myself up from the hard marble porch. My knees were scraped and bruised, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the absolute hollow ache radiating from my chest. I stared at the forged syndicate document one last time, my eyes tracing the elegant curves of Victoria's signature, my wife, the woman I had promised to protect. The woman who had laid next to me every single night for 10 years while secretly engineering my execution. I shoved the wet paper deep into my jacket pocket and grabbed the handle of my suitcase. I did not look back at the massive oak doors of the Sterling estate. I just walked. My 10-year-old sedan was parked at the very edge of their circular driveway, looking entirely out of place next to Trent's brand-new imported sports cars. I threw my suitcase into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and slammed the door. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered before finally roaring to life. I cranked the heater to the maximum setting, but I could not stop shivering. I pulled out of the gated community, my tires slipping on the wet asphalt. I had no idea where I was going. My entire life had just been erased in a matter of 20 minutes. My first instinct was survival. I needed a roof over my head. I needed a dry place to sit down and think, to figure out how to hire a lawyer and fight back against Victoria's emergency divorce filing. I drove to a cheap motel just off the interstate. It was the kind of place with flickering neon lights and a lobby that smelled like stale smoke. I walked up to the front desk, completely soaked, and handed the night clerk my debit card. The clerk swiped the card. The machine beeped, flashing a red error message. He swiped it again with the same result. He looked up at me with a bored expression and told me the card was declined. I told him that was impossible. I knew exactly how much money was in my checking account. I had just deposited my paycheck 2 days ago. I pulled out my credit card and handed it over. The clerk swiped it, declined. I handed him another credit card, my emergency backup, declined. A cold sense of dread began to crawl up my spine, completely overshadowing the chill of my wet clothes. I walked back out to my car and grabbed my phone. I dialed the 24-hour automated customer service line for my primary bank. The automated voice asked for my account number. I typed it in. A moment later, the robotic voice informed me that my available balance was $0.00 and that my account was currently locked. I bypassed the automated system and demanded to speak to a representative. After 10 agonizing minutes on hold, a woman finally answered. I gave her my security information and frantically asked why my accounts were frozen. Her voice grew suddenly very cold and professional. She informed me that all of my accounts had been placed under an emergency freeze due to a high-level fraud investigation. She said the bank had received a verified alert regarding illicit offshore wire transfers tied to an illegal sports betting syndicate. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I told her I did not make any transfers. I told her someone had stolen my identity and forged my signature. The representative paused. She said the fraud alert was initiated directly by the regional vice president of their corporate oversight division. She read the name aloud. Trent Sterling. My brother-in-law had not just thrown me out of his house. He had used his massive corporate banking connections to completely lock me out of my own life. He had cut off my access to my own money, my own savings, and my own credit. I was entirely financially paralyzed. I hung up the phone and dropped my head against the steering wheel. The reality of my situation crushed down on me like a concrete block. I had $14 in my wallet. That was it. That was the sum total of my financial existence. I drove away from the motel because I did not even have enough cash to pay for a room. I ended up in a massive, brightly lit Walmart parking lot. I parked under a flickering street lamp near the back of the lot, surrounded by recreational vehicles and empty shopping carts. I turned off the engine to save gas. The cold immediately began creeping through the windows. I spent my first night as a homeless man sleeping in the driver's seat of my 10-year-old sedan. I wrapped myself in a damp blanket I found in my trunk. I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Victoria's face. I saw the cold, calculated look in her eyes as she handed me that forged bank statement. I replayed our last 10 years together, searching for clues, searching for the moment she decided I was nothing more than a disposable piece of trash. She had complained about our house not being big enough. She had complained about my salary not keeping up with her brother's bonuses. But I never imagined she possessed the sheer cruelty to manufacture a fake gambling debt just to steal our legitimate assets in a divorce. She wanted to walk away looking like the tragic, betrayed wife, while leaving me with a destroyed reputation and a mountain of fabricated debt. Morning arrived with a cruel gray light. My body ached from sleeping in the cramped seat. My clothes were still damp and I felt completely hollowed out. I reached for the ignition key thinking I could drive to a gas station to wash my face and figure out my next move. Before I could turn the key, a loud, violent banging sound echoed through the car. I jolted awake, my heart hammering in my chest. A large man in a high-visibility jacket was standing outside my window, hitting the glass with his knuckles. Behind my car, a heavy-duty tow truck was backing up, its yellow lights flashing in the early morning gloom. I rolled down the window, my breath pluming in the freezing air. I asked the man what he was doing. The man did not smile. He handed me a folded piece of paper through the window. He told me he was repossessing the vehicle. I stared at him in disbelief. I told him I owned this car outright. I paid it off 3 years ago. There was no auto loan, so there was nothing to repossess. The man pointed a thick finger at the paper in my hand. He told me to read the court order. He said a judge had granted an emergency asset seizure this morning. I unfolded the paper. It was an injunction filed by Victoria's legal team. They had officially petitioned the court to seize all marital assets, including my vehicle, claiming that I was a flight risk and a degenerate gambler who might sell the assets to fund my offshore syndicate debts. Because Victoria's name was also on the vehicle registration from when we first bought it, her high-priced lawyers had managed to push through a temporary seizure order before I even had a chance to speak to a judge. The repo man looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and pity. He told me I had 2 minutes to get my personal belongings out of the car before he hooked it up to the truck. If I resisted, he said he would call the police. I had no power. I had no money. I had no lawyer to fight the injunction. I stepped out of the car into the freezing morning air. I opened the trunk and pulled out my heavy black suitcase. I watched in absolute helpless silence as the tow truck lifted my sedan off the ground and drove away, taking my shelter and my mobility with it. I was standing in the middle of a sprawling asphalt parking lot, shivering in damp clothes, holding a suitcase. I had never felt so utterly small in my entire life, but I still had one thing left. I had my job. I had worked as a regional supply chain manager for the same logistics company for 10 years. I had built a sterling reputation. I had never missed a deadline. I had never taken a sick day. I figured if I could just get to the office, I could talk to human resources. I could ask for a cash advance on my paycheck. I could sit at my desk, drink a hot cup of coffee, and use the company phone to start calling legal aid clinics. I walked 2 miles to the nearest bus stop, dragging my heavy suitcase over the cracked sidewalks. I used $2 from my wallet to pay the fare. The bus was crowded and people stared at my wrinkled, damp clothes. I ignored them, focusing entirely on getting to the sanctuary of my office. When I finally arrived at the corporate logistics building, I felt a tiny sliver of hope. I walked through the sliding glass doors and approached the security turnstiles. I pulled my employee badge from my wallet and tapped it against the scanner. The scanner flashed red. Access denied. I tried again. Red. Before I could ask the receptionist for help, 2 large security guards stepped out from behind the front desk. They did not greet me with their usual friendly smiles. They approached me with their hands resting near their utility belts, their expressions tight and serious. One of the guards, a man I had bought coffee for just last week, told me I was not allowed past the lobby. He said Human Resources had flagged my badge early this morning. I asked him what was going on. I told him I was a senior manager. Before the guard could answer, the elevator doors chimed open. My department director, a man named Greg, stepped out into the lobby. He was accompanied by the head of Human Resources. Greg did not look at me with sympathy. He looked at me with profound, absolute disgust. I walked toward him, dragging my suitcase, desperate for a lifeline. I told Greg there had been a terrible misunderstanding. I told him my wife's family was trying to ruin me and that I just needed to get to my desk to sort things out. Greg held up his hand, stopping me in my tracks. His voice echoed through the quiet marble lobby. He told me I did not have a desk anymore. He said I was terminated effective immediately. I stood there completely stunned. I asked him how he could fire me without even speaking to me. I had given a decade of my life to this company. Greg crossed his arms over his chest. He told me he received a phone call at 6 o'clock this morning from Trent Sterling. Trent was a major corporate player in our city, a man with massive influence and deep pockets. Greg said Trent had warned the company as a professional courtesy. Trent had claimed that I was deeply involved in an offshore gambling syndicate and that I had a massive, unpayable debt. But Trent did not stop there. Trent had told my boss that he suspected I was preparing to embezzle funds from the company's supply chain accounts to cover my gambling losses. Trent used his own fabricated bank statements to convince my employer that I was a massive liability, a desperate criminal willing to steal from my own workplace to satisfy violent loan sharks. I felt the blood drain entirely from my face. I pleaded with Greg. I told him it was a lie. I told him Victoria and Trent forged those documents to steal my assets in a divorce. I begged him to look at my 10-year track record. I had never touched a single cent of company money. Greg shook his head. He said the company could not take the risk. He said corporate security had already audited my accounts and locked my system access. He told me my final paycheck would be mailed to whatever address I provided, assuming the courts did not seize it first. Greg looked me up and down, taking in my wet clothes, my pale face, and the large suitcase standing beside me. He sneered, telling me he always wondered why I seemed so tense lately. He said I was a disgrace and he ordered the security guards to escort me off the property immediately. I was marched out of the building like a common criminal. The security guards watched me until I was all the way off the corporate campus, standing on the edge of the busy highway. The systematic destruction of my life was completely flawless. Trent and Victoria had executed their plan with terrifying precision. They attacked my marriage to break my spirit. They froze my bank accounts to break my resources. They seized my car to break my mobility. And they fabricated a story to my employer to destroy my reputation and my only source of income. They had methodically severed every single cord that connected me to society. I was 38 years old, standing on the side of a noisy road with nothing but a suitcase full of damp clothes. The rain started falling again, a slow, miserable drizzle that soaked right through my jacket. I began walking because I had absolutely nothing else to do. I walked for hours. I walked until my feet were blistered and my arms ached from carrying the heavy bag. I walked past neighborhoods I could no longer afford to live in and stores I could no longer afford to enter. The sheer weight of the injustice felt like a physical pressure crushing my chest. I had played by the rules my entire life. I had been loyal, I had been honest, and my reward was total annihilation. By mid-afternoon, the hunger and the cold became unbearable. I found myself in a run-down industrial neighborhood on the edge of the city. There was a small, fading diner sitting on the corner of a cracked intersection. The neon sign in the window flickered, buzzing with a cheap electrical hum. I pushed through the glass door, the small bell ringing above my head. The diner was nearly empty. The air smelled strongly of old grease and burnt coffee. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth in the far back corner, placing my suitcase on the seat beside me. I pulled my wallet out and counted my remaining cash. $14. That was it. I was a man who just yesterday had a comfortable savings account, a beautiful home, and a solid career. Now I was staring at a $10 bill and 4 singles, wondering how many days I could stretch a plate of cheap eggs and toast. I rested my elbows on the sticky table and buried my face in my hands. The fight had completely drained out of me. Victoria had won. Trent had won. The Sterling family had successfully erased me just like they always wanted. I had no resources to fight them in court. I had no evidence to prove the documents were forged. I was just a broken man sitting in a cheap diner, waiting for the inevitable end. The little bell above the diner door rang again. I did not look up. I heard the heavy, steady sound of expensive leather shoes walking across the scuffed linoleum floor. The footsteps moved deliberately, passing the empty tables near the front and heading straight toward the back corner where I was hiding. The footsteps stopped directly in front of my booth. I slowly lifted my head. Standing across from me was an older man. He was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit that looked completely out of place in this grimy diner. He had thick silver hair, piercing blue eyes, and an expression that held absolute authority. He carried an old, weathered leather briefcase in his right hand. Without asking for permission, the man slid into the booth across from me. He placed the leather briefcase on the sticky table. He looked at my wet clothes, my pale face, and the pathetic $14 sitting in front of me. He did not offer me pity. He did not ask how I was doing. He leaned forward, resting his hands on top of his briefcase. He told me his name was Jeremiah Cobb. He said he was a legacy estate attorney, and then he looked me dead in the eyes and told me he had spent the last 20 years working for my late father, waiting for the exact day the Sterling family finally decided to throw me away. I stared across the sticky diner table at Jeremiah Cobb. He looked completely out of place sitting on cracked red vinyl. He wore a tailored wool suit, a silk tie, and a gold watch that probably cost more than my entire annual salary. But his face was hard. He had the kind of eyes that missed absolutely nothing. I had not seen him since my father passed away nearly 5 years ago. My father trusted Jeremiah with everything. He was a ruthless corporate lawyer who handled estate planning for the old money families in the city. And now he was sitting across from a man who had $14 to his name. I expected pity. I expected him to ask me what had happened or offer to buy me a hot meal. He did none of those things. He did not even look at the menu. He simply unlatched his weathered leather briefcase, reached inside, and placed something small and metallic directly in the center of the table. It was a key. It was old, heavy, and covered in a thin layer of rust. It had the number 814 stamped into the brass. I asked him what it was. My voice cracked because my throat was raw from the cold and the shock of the last 12 hours. I told him I needed a lawyer, not a puzzle. I told him my wife and her brother had just framed me for a massive gambling debt, seized my car, fired me from my job, and thrown me into the street. I begged him to help me file an injunction. I told him I had nothing left. Jeremiah leaned forward. His voice was incredibly calm, almost clinical. He told me to stop talking and listen very carefully. He said he already knew everything that had happened to me today. He knew about the emergency divorce filing. He knew about the forged offshore bank statements. He knew about Trent Sterling getting me fired. I was stunned. I asked him how he could possibly know all of that. Jeremiah did not blink. He said he knew because my father predicted this exact scenario 5 years ago. A cold chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. I stared at the rusty key on the table. Jeremiah explained that my father was a very observant man. He watched the way the Sterling family treated me. He saw the greed in Victoria's eyes when she thought no one was looking. He recognized Trent Sterling for exactly what he was. A corporate predator who built his wealth on leverage, arrogance, and the destruction of weaker men. My father knew that if he left me liquid cash or standard investment portfolios when he died, the Sterlings would eventually find a way to take it. He knew Victoria would use her marital status to bleed my accounts dry, or that Trent would manipulate the courts to seize my assets. My father realized that the only way to protect my inheritance was to hide it in plain sight, in a form that they could not easily steal, and to lock it away until the very moment they tried to destroy me. I felt a hard lump form in my throat. My father had seen the truth about my marriage before I ever did. He had known I was living in a den of vipers while I was busy trying to buy them anniversary gifts. Jeremiah tapped a manicured finger against the rusty key. He told me this key opened safe deposit box 814 at the First National Legacy Bank downtown. It was an independent old-school vault that did not digitize its physical storage records. Victoria and her high-priced lawyers could not find it in a standard digital asset search. Trent and his corporate banking connections could not freeze it. I reached out and picked up the key. It felt heavy and cold in my palm. I asked Jeremiah how much money was inside the box. I told him I just needed enough cash to hire a defense attorney and rent a cheap motel room so I could sleep. I was desperate. I was shivering, starving, and terrified of spending another night sleeping in a Walmart parking lot. Jeremiah stood up from the booth. He buttoned his suit jacket and looked down at me with absolute steel in his eyes. He said there was no money in the box. He said if I was looking for a quick handout to pay for a cheap motel, I had completely missed the point of the man my father raised me to be. He told me I was in a war. And in a war, you do not need a motel room. You need ammunition. Jeremiah pulled a crisp $20 bill from his wallet and threw it on the table to cover my coffee. He told me to take a bus downtown, walk into that vault, and read exactly what my father had left for me. He said once I understood what I actually owned, I should call his private office number, and not a single second before. Without another word, Jeremiah turned and walked out of the diner. The little bell above the door rang, and he disappeared into the freezing rain, leaving me alone with a rusty key and a head full of terrifying questions. I sat in that booth for another 20 minutes, just gripping the key so tightly the brass numbers dug into my skin. My logical brain told me this was insane. I was a homeless man with a forged $500,000 bounty on my head. I needed legal aid, not a scavenger hunt. But the memory of my father stopped me from throwing the key away. My father was a serious, brilliant man. He did not play games. If he left this for me, he left it for a reason. I picked up my heavy suitcase and walked back out into the storm. I walked 3 blocks to the nearest bus stop. I used $2 from my pathetic $14 reserve to pay the fare. The bus was packed with miserable, damp commuters. I stood near the back, holding my wet suitcase, ignoring the strange looks people gave me. I did not care anymore. The shame of being thrown out by Victoria had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of anger in my chest. The bus dropped me off right in the heart of the downtown financial district. The First National Legacy Bank was a massive, imposing building made of dark granite and towering marble columns. It looked like an impenetrable fortress from the 1920s. I walked through the heavy revolving doors, dragging my wet suitcase across the pristine, polished marble floor. The security guards immediately turned to look at me. I was a soaking wet, exhausted man carrying luggage into a billionaire playground. A guard stepped forward, raising his hand to stop me, but I did not hesitate. I walked straight up to the main desk, pulled the rusty key from my pocket, and slammed it down on the smooth glass counter. I told the teller my name was Harrison Blake, and I demanded access to box 814. The teller looked at my key, then typed my name into an ancient computer system. Her eyes widened slightly. She picked up a heavy brass phone and dialed a number. Within 2 minutes, the bank manager himself came out from a back office. He did not look at my wet clothes or my scuffed shoes. He looked at the key, and then he treated me with the utmost respect. He asked me to follow him. We walked past the tellers down a long hallway paneled in dark mahogany and descended a wide staircase into the basement. The vault door was massive. It was a giant circular piece of solid steel with complicated gears and locking mechanisms. The manager spun a heavy wheel and the door swung open with a deep echoing groan. The room inside was lined from floor to ceiling with hundreds of narrow metal doors. The manager led me down the third aisle and stopped in front of a box near the bottom. The metal plate read 814. He inserted his master key into the first slot and turned it. Then he stepped back and gestured for me to use my key. My hands were shaking again. I knelt down on the cold stone floor. I slid the rusty key into the second slot. I took a deep breath, praying there was something inside that could save my life, and turned the key. The lock clicked. I pulled the long metal box out of the wall and carried it to a small private viewing room in the corner of the vault. The manager closed the door, leaving me completely alone in total silence. I stood over the box. The metal was cold. I flipped the 2 latches and opened the lid. Jeremiah was right. There was no money. There were no stacks of $100 bills. There were no gold bars or bearer bonds. Instead, the box was packed with paper, thick, heavy stacks of yellowing documents bound together with rubber bands. I reached in and pulled the first stack out. They looked like ancient legal contracts. I flipped through the pages, completely confused. They were complex zoning deeds, municipal property blueprints, and commercial land surveys dated 40 years ago. There were maps of the city with certain commercial sectors highlighted in bright red marker. I felt a crushing wave of disappointment wash over me. I needed a way to fight a ruthless corporate developer and a vicious divorce lawyer. I did not need 40-year-old maps. I dropped the stack of deeds onto the table. I thought my father had gone crazy in his final years. I thought Jeremiah had sent me on a fool errand. I was ready to walk out of that vault, leave the papers behind, and go sleep under a bridge. But then I looked back into the metal box. Resting at the very bottom, underneath the last stack of blueprints, was a single white envelope. My name was written across the front in my father's steady, familiar handwriting. I picked it up, broke the seal, and unfolded a single sheet of heavy stationery. I began to read. Harrison, if you are reading this, it means my worst fears have come true. It means Victoria and the Sterling family have finally shown you their true colors. I know you are likely hurt, confused, and feeling entirely defeated. They have probably tried to strip you of your pride and your assets. They operate through intimidation smoke and mirrors. They want you to believe they are untouchable, but they are completely wrong. The letter continued, and the words began to strike me like physical blows. My father wrote that he never trusted Richard Sterling. Decades ago, long before Trent was a corporate hotshot, Richard was a desperate, failing real estate developer. Richard needed premium commercial land in the center of the city to build his first major corporate plaza, but he did not have the cash to buy it. My father owned that land. It had been in our family for 3 generations. I read the next paragraph twice because my brain refused to process the magnitude of what it said. Richard begged my father to sell the land. My father refused to sell a single inch of our family legacy. But my father made a deal. He agreed to lease the massive tract of commercial land to Richard Sterling for 50 years. The agreement allowed Richard to build his corporate high-rises, his luxury condominiums, and his gated communities on top of our dirt. I dropped the letter on the table. My hands were trembling so violently I had to grip the edge of the wood just to stay standing. I looked at the stacks of old zoning deeds and blueprints scattered in front of me. I frantically grabbed a blueprint and unrolled it. I traced the red lines with my finger. The red lines outlined the exact location of Trent Sterling massive flagship corporate headquarters, the very building where he had just ordered his security guards to throw me out into the street. I grabbed another map. The red lines marked the exact coordinates of the sprawling, ultra-exclusive gated community where Victoria and I had lived. The exact estate she had just thrown my suitcase out of this afternoon. They did not own the land. None of it. The Sterlings had spent the last 4 decades building a multi-million-dollar real estate empire on a foundation they did not actually own. They were nothing but tenants, and I was their landlord. I snatched the letter back up and read the final sentences. My father wrote that he hid these original lease deeds in this vault specifically because he knew the Sterlings would panic as the end of the lease approached. If the lease expired, ownership of every single building, every single corporate tower, and every single luxury home sitting on that land would legally default back to the landowner, to me. The pieces of the nightmare finally slammed into place. The entire gambling debt was a massive, desperate smokescreen. Trent and Victoria did not forge those offshore bank statements just to get rid of me. They framed me for a $500,000 debt so they could force a rapid emergency divorce settlement. They planned to seize my inherited assets as compensation for the fake debt before I ever figured out what those assets were worth. They were trying to steal the ground right out from under my feet before Trent knew corporate merger required him to prove he owned the land. I read the final line of my father letter. It was written in bold, dark ink. Harrison, check the date on the original lease contract. Do not let them take what is yours. Burn their empire to the ground. I dropped the letter and tore through the stack of legal documents until I found the master commercial lease agreement. It was signed by my father and Richard Sterling. I flipped straight to the final page, my eyes scanning the dense legal text until I found the expiration clause. I looked at the date. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and checked the current calendar. My breath caught in my throat. The heavy vault walls seemed to spin around me. The 50-year lease on the entire Sterling real estate empire did not expire in a month. It did not expire next week. The lease expired in exactly 72 hours. I stood in the silent, heavily armored vault, staring at the date printed on the bottom of the master lease agreement. My hands were shaking so badly that the heavy parchment paper rattled in the quiet room. 72 hours. That was all the time I had left. The 50-year lease on the entire Sterling real estate empire was about to expire. Everything they had built, the massive corporate towers, the luxury condominiums, the gated community where Victoria and I had lived, all of it was sitting on land that legally belonged to my father, and now it belonged to me. The sheer scale of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I dropped the lease agreement onto the table and fell back into the uncomfortable metal chair. The pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking into place, and the picture they formed was absolutely terrifying. The fake World Cup gambling debt was never just about destroying my reputation or throwing me out of the house. It was an incredibly elaborate, perfectly timed smokescreen. Trent and Victoria knew this lease was expiring on Friday. They knew that if the lease expired, their entire family empire would completely collapse. They would lose their flagship corporate headquarters. They would lose the land beneath their homes. They would lose everything that made them the powerful, untouchable Sterling family. So they engineered a trap. By framing me for a massive illegal gambling debt, Victoria had the perfect excuse to file for an emergency expedited divorce. In family court, when one spouse is proven to be a dangerous, degenerate gambler draining marital funds, the judge almost always awards the remaining assets to the innocent spouse. My father had left me these land deeds, but on paper, they just looked like 40-year-old zoning permits for undeveloped dirt. To a family court judge, they would appear completely worthless. Victoria was planning to claim my inherited assets in the divorce settlement as compensation for the $500,000 I allegedly owed her family. She was going to steal my father's legacy right out from under me to save her brother corporate empire. She had kissed me, slept next to me, and planned our future while secretly orchestrating my total financial execution. I grabbed my cell phone with trembling hands. My battery was at 12%, but I had enough power to make one call. I dialed the private office number Jeremiah Cobb had given me. He answered on the first ring. I did not bother with the greeting. I told him I was standing in the vault. I told him I had read the lease and I saw the expiration date. Jeremiah's voice was calm and steady over the phone. He told me to pack every single document into my suitcase, leave the bank, and come straight to his private practice. He said we had a tremendous amount of work to do and absolutely no time to waste. I carefully stacked the zoning deeds, the blueprints, and my father's handwritten letter back into the metal box. I locked it, took the rusty key, and hurried out of the vault. The bank manager escorted me out without asking a single question. I walked back out into the freezing rain, dragging my damp suitcase behind me. I did not have enough money for a taxi, so I walked 12 blocks through the heart of the financial district to reach Jeremiah's office. His private practice was located on the top floor of a historic brick building. It was quiet, incredibly private, and smelled of polished leather and old books. Jeremiah was waiting for me in his massive corner office. He had a large oak desk covered in legal pads and thick law books. He pointed to a plush leather chair and told me to sit down. I opened my suitcase and pulled out the stacks of documents. I placed the master lease agreement directly in front of him. I told him Victoria and Trent were using the emergency divorce to seize these deeds before Friday. Jeremiah put on a pair of silver reading glasses and carefully examined the original signature on the lease. He nodded slowly. He told me my assessment of the divorce strategy was entirely correct, but he said the divorce was only half of their plan. He asked me if I knew about the massive corporate merger Trent was celebrating at the family dinner yesterday. I told him I knew Trent was popping champagne over it, but I did not know the details. Jeremiah leaned back in his leather chair and took off his glasses. He explained the legal mechanics of corporate real estate. Trent Sterling Company was highly leveraged. He had borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars to build his empire. To pay off those debts, Trent was selling his entire company to a massive international conglomerate. The merger was scheduled to be legally finalized this Friday at noon. Jeremiah's voice grew intensely serious. He told me there was a very specific dangerous loophole in commercial real estate law regarding corporate acquisitions. If Trent finalized that merger while the Sterling family still controlled the land, the new international conglomerate would absorb the property rights. The land would be bundled into a multi-billion-dollar international portfolio. Once that happened, it would take me 10 years and millions of dollars in legal fees to even get a hearing in federal court to fight for my land back. Trent did not just need the land. He needed me entirely out of the picture before Friday at noon. He needed me homeless broke and legally barred from claiming my inheritance so his corporate buyers would not see any red flags on the property title during the final merger audit. The realization made me sick to my stomach. They had timed the fake gambling debt, the divorce, and the job termination perfectly. They attacked my survival and my reputation simultaneously so I would be too busy fighting for a meal to fight for my fatherland. I looked across the desk at Jeremiah. I asked him what we could possibly do. I had $14, I had no car, I had no job. Victoria lawyers were probably already pushing the divorce settlement through the courts. Jeremiah stood up from his desk. He walked over to a dark wooden filing cabinet and pulled out a massive stack of blank legal forms. He dropped them onto his desk with a heavy thud. He told me we were going to wage war. He said we had to file a massive preemptive injunction in county court. We had to legally block the emergency divorce settlement, and at the exact same time we had to file a formal dispute on the commercial property title. If we placed a legal hold on the land deeds, Trent corporate buyers would see the red flag in their system. They would immediately halt the merger until the ownership dispute was resolved. But Jeremiah warned me the window was incredibly tight. We had to draft, finalize, and physically file the injunction at the county courthouse before it closed today. If we waited until tomorrow, Victoria lawyers might finalize the emergency asset forfeiture, and Trent would push the merger through. I grabbed a pen from his desk. I told him to tell me exactly where to sign. For the next 4 hours, Jeremiah's office became a frantic war room. My wet clothes dried against my skin, leaving me cold and stiff, but the adrenaline rushing through my veins kept me moving. Jeremiah dictated complex legal arguments while his paralegals typed furiously. I signed my name on dozens of affidavits, sworn statements, and financial declarations. I had to formally testify under penalty of perjury that the offshore gambling accounts were fraudulent. I had to state that my signature was forged. I had to officially declare that Victoria Sterling was attempting to commit marital asset theft through deception. Every time I signed my name, I felt a sharp pang of grief mixed with a rising tide of pure rage. I was signing away my marriage. I was formally declaring war on the woman I had loved. But I remembered the cold, blank look on her face when she threw my suitcase out into the rain. I remembered Trent laughing at me while I stood on the porch shivering. They had not treated me like family. They had treated me like an obstacle to be eliminated. By the time we finished the paperwork, it was late afternoon. The county courthouse closed at 5 o'clock. We had exactly 45 minutes to get across town and file the injunction. Jeremiah grabbed his leather briefcase and shoved the thick stack of signed documents inside. He told me we were walking because the downtown traffic was completely deadlocked in the rain. We left his office and hit the pavement. My feet were blistered from walking all morning and my stomach was cramping from hunger, but I forced myself to keep pace with the older attorney. We navigated the crowded sidewalks, dodging umbrellas and deep puddles. The rain had not stopped since yesterday. It felt like the city itself was trying to wash me away, but I refused to let it happen. We reached the county courthouse with exactly 15 minutes to spare. It was a massive, imposing concrete building filled with metal detectors and armed guards. We rushed through security and practically ran up the marble stairs to the civil filing department. The clerk behind the thick glass window looked exhausted. She was already reaching to turn off the open sign on her desk. Jeremiah slid the massive stack of paperwork through the slot just as she touched the switch. He politely but firmly demanded that the injunction be stamped and entered into the judicial record immediately. He cited emergency legal statutes regarding impending corporate fraud. The clerk sighed, adjusted her glasses, and began reading the cover page. I stood next to Jeremiah, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I watched the clerk lift her heavy red rubber stamp. She pressed it into an ink pad, aligned it over the top of our injunction, and slammed it down onto the paper. The sound of that stamp hitting the paper was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life. The legal block was officially in place. The divorce settlement could not be finalized. The commercial property title was now flagged. Trent's massive corporate merger was officially paralyzed. Jeremiah thanked the clerk, took our copies of the stamped documents, and put them safely into his briefcase. He turned to me, and for the first time all day, I saw a tiny, genuine smile touch the corners of his mouth. He told me the first shot had been fired. Now we just had to wait for the Sterling family to realize their entire empire was burning. The adrenaline that had been keeping me upright suddenly began to fade. My body felt incredibly heavy. The exhaustion, the hunger, and the emotional trauma of the last 24 hours crashed down on me all at once. I leaned against the marble wall of the courthouse hallway, taking slow, deep breaths. Jeremiah patted my shoulder. He told me he would advance me enough cash to get a hot meal and a decent hotel room for the night. He said the court would notify Victoria legal team about the injunction first thing tomorrow morning, and we needed to be rested and prepared for their retaliation. We walked slowly back down the grand marble staircase toward the main entrance of the courthouse. The building was emptying out as the clerks and lawyers headed home for the day. I was completely focused on the thought of a warm bed and a hot shower. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the wide concrete steps leading down to the street. The rain had finally slowed to a light drizzle, but the sky was dark and gray. I zipped up my damp jacket and looked toward the street to find a taxi. My blood instantly ran cold. Parked illegally in the loading zone directly in front of the courthouse steps was Trent's brand new black imported sports car. The headlights were on, cutting through the gloomy evening light. Standing on the bottom step, completely blocking my path to the street, were Trent and Victoria. They looked pristine. Victoria was wearing an expensive trench coat, her hair perfectly styled, completely unaffected by the damp weather. Trent was wearing a tailored navy blue suit, his hands casually resting in his pockets. They looked like royalty waiting to inspect a peasant. I stopped halfway down the steps. Jeremiah stopped beside me, his grip tightening on the handle of his briefcase. Trent looked up at me and smiled. It was that same arrogant, vicious smirk he had worn at the dinner table yesterday. He slowly pulled his right hand out of his pocket. He was holding a thick, folded legal document. Victoria stepped forward. She looked at my wrinkled, damp clothes and my exhausted face. Her eyes were completely void of any humanity. She did not see a husband. She saw a problem that needed to be solved. Trent held the folded document out toward me. His voice was smooth and dangerously calm. He told me they had been looking for me all day. He said Victoria legal team had drafted a highly generous final settlement offer. I stared at the paper in his hand, feeling a surge of absolute disgust. I did not say a word. Victoria crossed her arms. She told me to listen to her brother. She said this was the absolute last chance I was going to get. She explained that the settlement offer required me to formally sign away any and all claims to marital assets, inheritance properties, and future financial support. It completely severed me from the Sterling family and anything associated with my father estate. Trent took a step up the concrete stairs, closing the distance between us. He looked at me with cold, predatory eyes. Trent told me that if I took his pen right now and signed the document on the hood of his car, they would make the offshore gambling debt completely disappear. They would call the bank and drop the fraud investigation. They would generously allow me to walk away with nothing, but I would get to keep my freedom. But if I refused to sign, Trent promised to pick up his phone and call the federal authorities. He said he had a perfectly documented paper trail proving I was a dangerous corporate embezzler and a syndicate gambler. He told me I would be arrested before the sun went down. Victoria looked me dead in the eyes and delivered the final ultimatum. She said to sign the paper, and they would not press criminal charges. If I refused, I was going to federal prison tonight. I woke up in a cheap motel room paid for by Jeremiah Cobb. The thin blanket scratched against my skin, but it was better than my freezing car. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I looked at the cracked screen and saw Victoria's name flashing. This was the moment I had to execute my part of the strategy. The legal injunction was secretly working its way through the county court system right now, but I needed to keep Trent and Victoria completely distracted. If they checked the property title registry this morning, they would see the legal hold and panic. I needed them arrogant. I needed them blind. I answered the phone and made my voice sound incredibly hollow and defeated. I let my words shake just enough to sound authentic. I told Victoria that the cold was too much and I had absolutely no money left to buy food. I told her I was completely beaten and I was ready to surrender. Victoria let out a short, cruel laugh. She told me she always knew I would break easily. She said I did not have the stamina to survive the real world outside of the comfortable little bubble her family had provided for me. I swallowed my anger and asked her where I needed to go to sign the asset forfeiture and the divorce papers. Victoria sounded absolutely triumphant. She told me to come to Trent Massive corporate headquarters at noon. She said her brother was hosting a major event in his executive boardroom, and I could quietly sign my rights away in the corner so she could finally be completely rid of me. She warned me not to cause a scene or Trent would follow through on his threat to call the federal authorities. I told her I understood. I hung up the phone and looked at my reflection in the hotel mirror. The man looking back at me was exhausted and betrayed, but his eyes were completely clear. I was ready to walk right into the lion den. Trent corporate headquarters was located in the most expensive sector of the downtown financial district. It was an intimidating fortress of sleek black glass and brushed steel soaring 50 stories into the sky. It was designed to make anyone standing outside feel small and insignificant. For 10 years, I had looked at this building and felt intimidated by Trent's massive success. But today, as I stood on the sidewalk looking up at the towering glass walls, I felt absolutely nothing but cold clarity. I knew the truth. Every single pane of glass and every steel beam was anchored into dirt that belonged to me. Trent was playing the role of a king in a castle he was renting from my father. I walked through the revolving glass doors and approached the front security desk. I was still wearing the same clothes I had been thrown out in yesterday. My shirt was wrinkled and my jacket was stained from sitting in a cheap diner. The 2 armed security guards in the lobby looked at me with immediate suspicion. I told them I was here to see Trent Sterling. One of the guards smirked and picked up his phone. He made a quick call and then pointed toward the private executive elevators. He told me to go straight to the top floor and keep my hands out of my pockets. The ride up to the 50th floor was completely silent. I watched the digital numbers climb higher and higher, taking me directly into the heart of the Sterling Empire. When the elevator doors finally chimed open, the noise hit me like a physical wall. Trent was not just having a small legal meeting. He was hosting a massive, opulent celebration. The executive boardroom had been transformed into a billionaire playground. A live string quartet was playing classical music in the corner. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos were weaving through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and expensive caviar. The room was packed with the most powerful people in the city. I recognized local politicians sitting on plush leather sofas. I saw international investors wearing bespoke suits laughing loudly and slapping Trent on the back. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the entire city skyline, making everyone in the room feel like they owned the world. And right in the center of the room, surrounded by a crowd of admiring investors, stood Trent Sterling. He was holding court looking like the absolute master of his universe. I stepped out of the elevator, and the heavy glass doors closed behind me. I stood on the edge of the plush carpet holding my cheap winter jacket. I looked entirely out of place like a stray dog that had somehow wandered into a royal banquet. A few of the guests turned to look at me. Their conversations stopped abruptly. They stared at my wrinkled clothes and my tired face with clear disgust. The music from the string quartet seemed to falter for a moment as the awkward silence spread across the room. Richard and Diane Sterling were standing near the catered buffet. When they saw me, Diane let out a loud, dramatic sigh. She placed her crystal glass on a table and whispered something to a wealthy politician wife standing next to her. Richard's face turned bright red. He marched across the room, pointing a thick finger directly at my chest. Richard kept his voice low, but his tone was venomous. He asked me what took me so long. He told me I was ruining the atmosphere of the most important day in their family history. He said I looked like a vagrant and told me to move toward the back conference table before his investors thought I was begging for spare change. I did not argue. I kept my head down and played the part of the broken, defeated husband. I walked slowly toward the massive, polished mahogany table at the far end of the boardroom. Victoria detached herself from a group of women and walked over to me. She was wearing a stunning designer dress that probably cost more than my car. She looked perfectly manicured and completely unbothered by the fact that she was about to finalize the destruction of our 10-year marriage. She stood very close to me, making sure the other guests could see her projecting strength and dominance. Victoria looked me up and down. Her eyes were completely cold. She leaned in and lowered her voice so only I could hear her cruel words. She told me I was pathetic. She said watching me walk into this room in dirty clothes only confirmed what she had known for years. She said I was a small, weak man who never had the ambition or the intellect to run with her family. She told me I was a parasite who had dragged her down, and that framing me for the gambling debt was the easiest decision she ever made. She said she did not even feel guilty about it because I deserved to lose everything for being so incredibly naive. I looked into the eyes of the woman I used to love. I searched her face for any trace of regret or hesitation, but there was absolutely none. She was entirely hollow inside. I kept my expression neutral. I told her I just wanted to sign the papers and go. Victoria smiled a terrible, satisfied smile. She turned around and signaled to her brother. Trent excused himself from the group of international investors. He walked toward the mahogany table, moving with the supreme confidence of a man who believed he had already won the war. A few of the key investors followed him, clearly amused by the spectacle. They knew who I was. Trent had obviously told them the fabricated story about my massive offshore gambling debt. They looked at me the way a person looks at an insect on the sidewalk. Trent stopped on the opposite side of the long wooden table. He picked up a thick leather binder and tossed it carelessly across the polished mahogany. It slid across the table and stopped directly in front of me. Trent spoke loudly, ensuring that the investors and the local politicians could hear every single word. He wanted an audience for my final execution. He announced that these were the final emergency asset forfeiture documents and the expedited divorce settlement. He said out of the immense kindness of his heart, he had convinced his sister not to pursue criminal wire fraud charges against me for my degenerate gambling habits. He told the crowd that the Sterling family believed in mercy even for criminals who tried to steal their wealth. The investors chuckled and nodded, murmuring their approval at Trent's supposed generosity. Richard and Diane stood in the background, beaming with pride at their brilliant, ruthless son. Trent reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. He held it out toward me. He told me to open the binder, read the final clause, and sign on the dotted line. He said once my signature was on that paper, I was completely stripped of all marital assets, all property claims, and any legal right to request financial support from his sister. He told me I would be legally erased from their family tree. I reached out and took the gold pen from his hand. The metal felt heavy and cold. I opened the thick leather binder. I looked at the pages of dense legal text. Victoria high-priced lawyers had drafted an incredibly airtight contract. It detailed the transfer of our home, our bank accounts, and my entire inherited estate to Victoria as compensation for the fake $500,000 syndicate debt. It was a masterpiece of legal theft. If I put my name on this paper, I would legally legitimize their lie. I would hand over my father 50-year land deeds without them ever knowing what they actually were. The entire boardroom fell completely silent. The string quartet stopped playing. The waiters stopped moving. Every single eye in the room was locked on me. The wealthy investors, the corrupt politicians, my cruel in-laws, and my treacherous wife were all waiting to watch me surrender my dignity and my future. Trent leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the mahogany table. He looked at me with absolute contempt. He told me to stop wasting his time. He said he had a $1 billion international merger to finalize in 10 minutes, and he wanted the trash taken out before he signed his own contracts. I looked down at the gold pen in my hand. I thought about the night I spent shivering in my car in the Walmart parking lot. I thought about the moment the tow truck dragged my vehicle away. I thought about the disgusted look on my boss face when he fired me because of Trent lies. They had taken everything they could reach. They had humiliated me in ways I never thought a person could endure. I slowly lifted my head. I looked past the legal documents. I looked past the gold pen. I looked directly into Trent Sterling's arrogant, confident eyes. And then for the first time in 2 days, I stopped pretending to be a broken man. I straightened my posture. I pulled my shoulders back. I let the facade of the defeated husband completely fall away. I looked around the lavish boardroom, taking in the expensive champagne, the tailored suits, and the panoramic view of the city skyline. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of calm wash over my entire body. I looked back at Trent. I let a slow, steady smile spread across my face. It was not a weak smile. It was the smile of a man who was holding the winning lottery ticket, while the rest of the world thought he was bankrupt. Trent frowned. His arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He did not understand why the pathetic homeless man standing across from him was suddenly smiling. He demanded to know what was so funny. He ordered me to sign the paper immediately. I gently closed the thick leather binder. I placed my hand flat on top of the dark leather cover. I looked at Victoria, who was suddenly stepping back, her eyes narrowing in confusion. I looked at Richard and Diane, who were staring at me with sudden intense suspicion. I reached out and placed the heavy gold fountain pen gently down onto the polished mahogany wood. The quiet click of the metal hitting the table echoed loudly in the silent room. I kept my eyes locked on Trent. My voice was no longer weak or hollow. It was deep resonant and filled with absolute, undeniable authority. I do not think I can afford this settlement, Trent. The silence in the massive, glass-walled boardroom was absolute and suffocating. It was the kind of heavy quiet that happens right before a devastating impact. I had just set the heavy gold pen down on the polished mahogany table and refused to sign away my life. I told Trent Sterling that I could not afford his generous settlement. Trent stared at me for a long moment. His arrogant, confident smirk slowly melted off his face, leaving behind a mask of pure, cold rage. He did not understand what was happening. To him, I was just a homeless, broken man who had been thoroughly crushed by his superior power. He expected me to beg for mercy or cry. He did not expect defiance. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd of wealthy investors and local politicians standing behind him. They shifted uncomfortably, holding their crystal champagne flutes. Victoria took a step forward, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Her face was flushed with anger. She asked me what I thought I was doing. She demanded that I pick up the pen and sign the papers immediately before she lost her patience and called the police. I looked at my wife, the woman who had slept beside me for 10 years while actively plotting my destruction. I told her I was done following her orders. I told her I knew exactly what she and her brother were trying to do, and I was not going to let them steal my father's legacy. Richard Sterling pushed his way to the front of the crowd. His face was purple with fury. He shouted that I was a delusional, pathetic loser who had lost his mind from the stress of his own gambling debts. He pointed a trembling finger at the 2 large security guards standing near the executive elevators. He ordered them to grab me, throw me to the ground, and physically drag me out of the building. He said I was trespassing and disturbing a multi-billion-dollar corporate event. The 2 heavily muscled security guards immediately began walking toward me. Their hands rested on their utility belts. Trent crossed his arms over his tailored navy blue suit and smiled again. He told me I had played a very stupid game, and now I was going to pay the ultimate price. He promised to make sure I spent the next 20 years in a federal prison for syndicate fraud. I did not move. I did not flinch. I just stood tall and kept my eyes locked on Trent. I knew what was coming. Before the security guards could even reach the mahogany table, the massive heavy wooden doors at the far end of the boardroom violently swung open. The sound was like a gunshot echoing through the cavernous space. Everyone in the room turned their heads in shock. The security guards stopped dead in their tracks. Trent dropped his arms, his jaw tightening in sudden irritation. Victoria let out a sharp gasp. Walking through those doors with absolute undeniable authority was Jeremiah Cobb. He was wearing his impeccable charcoal gray suit and carrying his weathered leather briefcase. But he was not alone. Flanking him on either side were two tall, broad-shouldered men wearing dark windbreakers. The bright yellow letters FBI were printed boldly across the back of their jackets, and heavy gold federal marshal badges hung from thick chains around their necks. They moved with strict military precision, their hands resting near their tactical holsters. Following closely behind the federal marshals was a younger man in a neat gray suit holding a heavy silver metallic briefcase. He looked incredibly focused and professional. The entire atmosphere in the opulent boardroom shifted instantly. The wealthy investors backed away, their expressions changing from arrogant amusement to sudden deep concern. The politicians looked nervously toward the exits. When federal marshals walk into a corporate boardroom uninvited, it never means anything good. Trent's face went completely pale for a fraction of a second before he forced his mask of corporate arrogance back into place. He stepped away from the mahogany table and walked toward Jeremiah. Trent demanded to know what was going on. He shouted that this was a private executive function and that Jeremiah was trespassing on Sterling property. He aggressively asked the federal marshals if they had a warrant to interrupt a sealed corporate merger signing. One of the federal marshals stepped forward and casually held up a thick legal document. He stated that they were not here to execute a search warrant. He said they were here to officially serve a federal injunction and provide security for a verified property owner who was currently facing organized corporate intimidation. The marshal looked directly at me and nodded respectfully. Then he looked back at Trent and told him to step away from the table and keep his voice down, or he would be detained for interfering with a federal mandate. Trent swallowed hard, taking a slow step backward. His eyes darted nervously between Jeremiah and the armed officers. Richard and Diane Sterling looked completely paralyzed with fear. Victoria was staring at Jeremiah with wide, terrified eyes, slowly realizing that her flawless plan was unraveling in real time. Jeremiah did not even look at Trent. He completely ignored the man who claimed to own the building. Instead, Jeremiah walked straight past the Sterling family and approached the massive interactive presentation screen mounted on the boardroom wall. He gestured for the young man with the silver briefcase to step forward. The young man opened his case, pulled out a small black laptop computer, and connected it to the main boardroom projector system. Jeremiah turned to face the crowd of international investors. His voice was calm, deep, and carried the weight of absolute truth. He introduced himself as Jeremiah Cobb, the managing partner of a legacy estate law firm. He apologized to the investors for interrupting their champagne celebration, but he assured them they would be incredibly grateful for his arrival. He looked directly at the lead investor, a distinguished older gentleman with silver hair who was supposed to sign the final merger contract today. Jeremiah told the lead investor that he was about to make a monumental billion-dollar mistake. He said the Sterling family had intentionally misled the investors about the core foundation of their entire corporate portfolio. Trent started shouting again, desperately trying to regain control of his boardroom. He yelled that Jeremiah was a liar and a fraud. He told the investors not to listen to a single word. He pointed at me and screamed that I was a degenerate criminal with a massive offshore gambling debt who had hired a desperate lawyer to extort his family. Trent practically begged the investors to ignore us and proceed with the merger. Jeremiah simply raised his hand, signaling the young man at the laptop. The massive glass screen behind Trent suddenly flickered to life. A high-resolution scanned image of an ancient yellowing legal document appeared on the wall. It was 50 feet wide and completely unavoidable. The dense legal text and the signatures at the bottom were perfectly legible. Jeremiah asked the room to please direct their attention to the screen. He explained that they were looking at a 50-year master commercial lease agreement. He noted that the signature on the left belonged to Richard Sterling. The signature on the right belonged to Harrison Blake, late father. The lead investor stepped forward, pushing his way past Trent to get a better look at the screen. He adjusted his glasses and read the document. His face grew incredibly serious. Jeremiah began to narrate the true history of the Sterling Empire. He explained to the wealthy crowd that 40 years ago, Richard Sterling was a failing developer with no capital and no premium land. He explained that my father owned the absolute best commercial dirt in the center of the financial district. Richard had begged my father to sell the land, but my father refused. Instead, my father leased the land to the Sterling family for 50 years, allowing them to build their corporate towers, their luxury condominiums, and their gated estates. Jeremiah's voice grew louder, ringing through the silent room. He pointed at the floor beneath their feet. He told the investors that Trent Sterling did not own the land this flagship corporate headquarters was built on. He told them Trent did not own the dirt beneath his own home. Every single brick, every pane of glass, and every steel beam belonged to the underlying property owner. And that owner was Harrison Blake. A collective gasp echoed through the room. The local politicians began whispering frantically to each other. The lead investor turned to Trent, his eyes narrowing with intense, furious suspicion. He asked Trent if this was true. He asked Trent if he was attempting to sell a corporate real estate portfolio without actually owning the underlying land deeds. Trent was sweating profusely. The collar of his expensive tailored shirt was suddenly tight around his neck. He stammered frantically, waving his hands in the air. He tried to dismiss the lease document. He shouted that the lease was completely irrelevant. Trent desperately pivoted to his final defense. He pointed at me with a shaking finger. He screamed that even if the lease was real, I had completely forfeited my rights to the property. He told the investors that I was currently undergoing an emergency divorce from his sister. He claimed I was a violent, degenerate gambler who had racked up $450,000 in offshore syndicate debts. He shouted that the family court had already issued a preliminary injunction to seize all of my inherited assets to cover my massive criminal liabilities. Trent turned to the lead investor, pleading with him. He promised that the land deeds would be legally transferred to Victoria Sterling by tomorrow morning, and then the corporate merger could proceed without any issues. He swore on his life that I was a completely broke, desperate fraud, trying to steal their money. Victoria stepped up next to her brother. She put on her best performance, trying to look like a terrified victim. She told the investors that I had ruined her life. She claimed she had to throw me out of her house to protect herself from the violent loan sharks I had brought into their world. She begged them to believe her brother. I stood silently watching them dig their own graves. I did not interrupt them. I let them spin their desperate, venomous lies in front of the most powerful people in the city. When Trent finally stopped shouting, breathless and covered in sweat, Jeremiah Cobb smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Jeremiah told Trent he was incredibly glad he had brought up the offshore gambling debt. Jeremiah signaled the young man at the laptop again. The image of the master lease agreement vanished from the massive screen. It was instantly replaced by a completely different set of documents. These documents bore the official crest of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cybercrimes Division. The entire boardroom seemed to collectively hold its breath. Jeremiah introduced the young man standing next to him. He explained that this was not just a legal assistant. This was a certified forensic accountant who specialized in tracing illicit digital offshore wire transfers for the federal government. Jeremiah turned back to the massive screen. He explained that yesterday afternoon I had been presented with forged bank statements claiming I owed nearly $500,000 to a World Cup betting syndicate. He said the Sterling family had used these exact forged documents to freeze my legitimate bank accounts, terminate my employment, and file an emergency asset forfeiture in family court. Jeremiah's voice dropped an octave, echoing with absolute lethal authority. He told the room that early this morning his forensic accountant had requested a rapid federal trace on the exact IP addresses used to open that illegal offshore syndicate account. He said they tracked the digital footprint of the massive wire transfers, hoping to find the identity thieves who had framed me. But Jeremiah said they did not have to look very far. He pointed to a highlighted section on the FBI cyber report displayed on the wall. He read the numbers aloud. It was a verified static IP address log. He explained that an IP address is like a digital fingerprint connecting a specific computer to a specific location on a specific network. Jeremiah looked directly at Trent. He asked Trent if he recognized the IP address on the screen. Trent did not answer. His face was the color of dirty chalk. His mouth opened and closed, but absolutely no sound came out. Jeremiah turned to the lead investor and delivered the final fatal blow. He stated that the illegal offshore gambling account, the exact account holding the $450,000 fabricated debt, was not opened from my home computer. It was not opened from my cell phone. It was opened from a secure private terminal located inside this exact corporate headquarters. It was opened on Trent Sterling personal encrypted executive network. The silence that followed was so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Jeremiah continued driving the nail completely through the coffin. He explained that the forensic accountant had pulled the building security logs and matched the timestamps. At the exact moment the illegal offshore account was created and the forged signature was digitally submitted, Trent Sterling and Victoria Sterling were logged into the private executive suite together. Jeremiah stated that I was never a gambler. I had never stolen a single dime. Trent and Victoria had systematically conspired to commit federal wire fraud, identity theft, and perjury in a calculated attempt to steal my father's land before the 50-year lease expired. The forensic accountant reached into his silver briefcase and pulled out several thick physical folders containing the verified FBI cyber reports. He handed one folder to the lead investor and passed the others to the local politicians. The lead investor opened the folder. He read the technical data, the IP trace logs, and the matched timestamps. He looked at the forged signatures and the fake bank statements Trent had used to destroy my life. The older gentleman's hands began to shake, not with fear, but with absolute burning outrage. He looked up from the folder and stared directly at Trent Sterling. Trent took another step backward, his tailored suit suddenly looking far too big for his shrinking frame. He raised his hands, palms outward, shaking his head frantically. He stammered out pathetic, desperate excuses. He claimed it was a misunderstanding. He said his network must have been hacked by outside competitors. He blamed his IT department. He even tried to blame Victoria, saying she had access to his office and must have done it without his knowledge. Victoria spun around and slapped Trent hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the boardroom. She screamed that he was a coward for trying to throw her under the bus. She yelled that creating the fake debt was entirely his idea to save his failing merger. The two siblings instantly turned on each other viciously, tearing their own family apart in front of a live audience. Richard Sterling grabbed his chest, gasping for air as he realized his son had just destroyed their entire legacy. Diane covered her face with her hands and began to sob uncontrollably. The illusion of the pristine, untouchable Sterling family was completely shattered into a million pieces. The lead investor slowly closed the FBI folder. He did not say a single word to Trent or Victoria. He did not yell or curse. He simply turned around and walked over to the polished mahogany table. Sitting on the table right next to the gold fountain pen I had refused to use was a massive stack of incredibly thick bound legal documents. It was the $100 million international merger contract Trent had been celebrating all afternoon. It was the absolute pinnacle of Trent corporate ambition. The lead investor picked up the massive contract with both hands. He looked at Trent Sterling with eyes full of absolute disgust and zero mercy. With one swift, violent motion, the lead investor ripped the thick contract entirely in half. The sound of tearing heavy paper ripped through the silent room like a thunderclap. He threw the torn pieces of the contract directly into Trent's face. The shredded paper fluttered to the floor, landing perfectly on the plush carpet. The lead investor turned to his associates and ordered them to leave the building immediately. He declared the deal completely dead. He stated that his international conglomerate would absolutely never do business with a desperate federal criminal who attempted to sell stolen property. The wealthy investors, the local politicians, and the corporate elite immediately began walking toward the elevators. They abandoned the champagne, the caviar, and the string quartet. They completely abandoned Trent Sterling, leaving him standing entirely alone in the center of his shattered boardroom. The federal marshals stepped forward, their hands dropping to their utility belts, moving to secure Trent and Victoria for formal questioning regarding the federal wire fraud evidence. I stood quietly near the mahogany table watching the empire burn completely to the ground. I had not raised my voice once. I had not thrown a single punch. I simply allowed the truth to step into the light, and exactly as my father predicted, the truth completely destroyed them. The sound of the heavy boardroom doors closing behind the departing investors sounded like the lid of a stone coffin slamming shut. A few moments ago, this room was filled with the intoxicating energy of infinite wealth. There was classical music playing and champagne flowing. Now the only sound was the harsh, ragged breathing of Trent Sterling as he stared down at the shredded pieces of the $100 million merger contract resting on the plush carpet. Trent dropped to his knees. The immaculate tailoring of his navy blue suit strained as he scrambled across the floor, gathering the torn pages of the contract with trembling hands. He tried to press the jagged edges of the paper back together, as if sheer willpower could magically reconstruct the deal that was supposed to save his entire empire. He was muttering to himself, whispering that it was a mistake and that he could fix it. He looked completely unhinged. I stood near the edge of the mahogany table and watched the destruction unfold. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I had spent 10 years allowing these people to make me feel small. I had spent 10 years believing I was the lucky one just to be allowed in their presence. Now the grand illusion was completely shattered. Jeremiah Cobb stood calmly near the massive presentation screen. He adjusted his suit jacket and looked down at Trent. Jeremiah's voice broke the suffocating silence with the cold precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. Jeremiah told Trent he could stop trying to put the paper back together. He explained that the physical contract did not matter anymore because the corporate entity it represented was about to cease to exist entirely. Richard Sterling pushed himself away from the catered buffet table. His face was pale and covered in a sickly sheen of sweat. He grabbed his chest, taking short, shallow breaths. Richard demanded to know what Jeremiah meant. He asked how a canceled merger could destroy the company. Jeremiah turned his attention to Richard and Diane. He looked at my former in-laws with absolute unyielding judgment. He explained the catastrophic domino effect of highly leveraged corporate debt. Jeremiah stated that Trent Sterling did not build a real estate empire using actual cash. He built it using massive predatory loans from aggressive institutional banks. Trent had borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars against the projected future value of the properties he developed. Jeremiah's voice echoed through the silent boardroom. He explained that those corporate loans contained strict financial covenants. The banks only allowed Trent to carry that massive mountain of debt because he had promised them a guaranteed payout from this specific international merger. The merger was the only safety net keeping the entire Sterling corporate structure from collapsing under its own crushing weight. Jeremiah pointed his finger directly at Richard. He said the moment the lead investor walked out of this building, the merger officially died. He said the banks would be notified within the hour. By tomorrow morning, automated financial algorithms would trigger a massive cross-default on every single loan associated with Trent Sterling name. Richard's face went from pale to a terrifying shade of purple. He stumbled backward, gripping the back of a leather chair to keep from collapsing to the floor. He stammered, asking how that affected his personal finances. Jeremiah did not hold back. He delivered the reality check with brutal efficiency. Jeremiah explained that Trent was severely overextended 2 years ago. To secure the final round of funding required to finish his flagship headquarters, Trent needed a massive personal guarantor. Jeremiah looked at Richard and stated that the public records showed Richard and Diane Sterling had personally guaranteed Trent corporate loans. Diane let out a sharp, horrifying scream. She dropped her crystal champagne flute. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into dozens of glittering pieces. Jeremiah continued, completely ignoring her outburst. He explained that Richard and Diane had legally pledged their massive private estate, their entire stock portfolio, their retirement pensions, and their liquid cash reserves as collateral for their son's corporate debt. Jeremiah said when the banks issue the default notices tomorrow morning, they will not just seize Trent Company. They will instantly freeze every single personal asset tied to the Sterling family name. The gravity of the situation slammed into the room with the force of a freight train. Richard and Diane Sterling had built their entire identity on their immense wealth. They viewed poor people as a lower species. They had treated me like a parasite for a decade simply because I worked for a living instead of inheriting a fortune. Now they were realizing that they had literally gambled their entire existence on a foundation of lies and stolen land. Diane lunged toward Trent. She grabbed the lapels of his expensive suit and began shaking him violently. Her perfect hair fell into her face, and her expensive makeup smeared as tears streamed down her cheeks. She screamed at her son, demanding to know if what the lawyer said was true. She screamed that she was not going to lose her country club membership. She yelled that she was not going to live in a cheap apartment like a common peasant. Trent pushed his mother away so hard she stumbled backward and nearly fell. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide and completely feral. The golden child of the Sterling family was gone. He was replaced by a cornered, desperate animal. Trent shouted that he was trying to save them. He screamed that the international merger would have made them billionaires. He pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that this was all my fault. He claimed that if I had just signed the settlement and walked away, they would have had the land deeds and the merger would have gone through flawlessly. He completely refused to take responsibility for his own massive criminal fraud. That was when Victoria realized the ship was officially sinking beneath the waves. My wife had been standing frozen near the back of the room, watching her family complete financial execution. She looked at the torn contract on the floor. She looked at her parents, who were now hyperventilating and weeping. She looked at Trent, who was screaming like a madman. And finally, she looked at the two armed federal marshals standing near the door. Victoria possessed an incredible survival instinct. She was a master manipulator who knew exactly when to pivot to save her own skin. She instantly, completely dropped her confident, aggressive posture. Victoria's shoulders slumped. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. She placed her hands over her mouth and forced tears to well up in her eyes. She turned toward the federal marshals and Jeremiah Cobb, completely abandoning her brother to the wolves. Victoria cried out that she had no idea what was really going on. Her voice trembled perfectly, sounding like a terrified victim. She pointed directly at Trent. She told the federal agents that Trent had forced her to sign those offshore gambling documents. She claimed Trent came to her weeks ago and told her I was in massive debt and that I was planning to bankrupt the family. She said Trent physically threatened her, demanding she cooperate with the emergency divorce to protect her own life. She walked toward the federal marshals, holding her hands out in a gesture of absolute surrender. She cried and said she was manipulated. She said she was terrified of her brother's violent temper and that she only forged the documents because he promised to protect her from the illegal syndicate. I stood there in absolute awe of her sociopathic performance. Less than an hour ago, she had leaned into my ear and called me a pathetic, weak loser who deserved to be completely ruined. Now she was playing the role of the innocent, manipulated sister. Trent stopped screaming at his parents. He turned slowly to look at Victoria. His eyes were wide with pure, absolute disbelief. He stared at his sister as if she had just driven a knife directly into his back. Trent let out a sound that was half laugh and half animalistic growl. The last remaining shred of his sanity completely snapped. He charged across the room toward Victoria. One of the federal marshals instantly stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Trent's chest, stopping him dead in his tracks. The marshal warned Trent to step back immediately, but Trent did not care. He was completely blinded by absolute rage. Trent pointed at Victoria and screamed that she was a lying, treacherous snake. His voice was so loud it rattled the expensive glass windows of the boardroom. He yelled that creating the fake gambling debt was entirely her idea. Trent turned to the federal marshals and began rapidly confessing to everything simply out of pure spite. He wanted to ensure that if he was going down, his sister was coming down with him. Trent shouted that Victoria had approached him months ago. He said Victoria was completely disgusted by my middle-class lifestyle. She hated my job and she hated the modest home we lived in. Trent revealed that Victoria had been secretly touring a massive multi-million-dollar villa in Aspen, Colorado. She wanted to buy it and move there permanently, but she did not have the liquid cash because her trust fund was tied up in the family real estate portfolio. Trent screamed that Victoria had snooped through my personal files at home. She was the one who found the keys and the old documents proving my father owned the land beneath their corporate empire. Trent said he did not even know the lease was expiring until Victoria brought him the information. Trent laughed a harsh, bitter laugh. He told the federal marshals that Victoria engineered the entire trap. She realized that if she simply divorced me, she would only get half of our modest savings. But if she framed me for a massive syndicate debt and rushed an emergency asset forfeiture, she could legally seize my inherited land deeds. She planned to sell the land deeds directly to Trent Company for a massive cash payout, so she could buy her Aspen villa and completely abandon her husband. The entire room fell silent again, except for the sound of Trent heavy breathing and Diane quiet sobbing. Victoria dropped her hands from her face. The fake tears completely vanished. Her expression morphed into something incredibly ugly and vicious. The mask of the terrified victim disappeared, revealing the true monster underneath. She stepped toward her brother and screamed right back at him. She called him a pathetic failure who had to beg their father for money just to start his ridiculous company. She yelled that Trent had never built anything of value in his entire life. She said he was a massive fraud who managed to run $1 billion real estate portfolio completely into the ground. Victoria shouted that she only offered to sell him the land deeds because she knew his international merger was going to fail without them. She said she was trying to save his miserable life, but he was too stupid to handle the paperwork properly. They stood inches apart, screaming the most incredibly toxic, hateful things at each other. They aired every single piece of dirty laundry their family possessed. They mocked each other failures, they insulted their parents, and they completely destroyed the illusion of the perfect, wealthy, sterling family. They were like two drowning rats fighting over a single piece of floating debris while the entire ship sank to the bottom of the ocean. I looked at Jeremiah Cobb. He was standing near the presentation screen watching the absolute chaos with a look of calm, professional satisfaction. He met my eyes and gave me a very small, almost imperceptible nod. He had told me earlier that we did not need to fight them. We just needed to expose them to the truth, and they would tear themselves completely apart. He was absolutely right. The federal marshals had finally heard enough. The lead marshal stepped forward, his voice cutting through the siblings' screaming match with heavy, undeniable authority. He ordered Trent and Victoria to turn around and place their hands behind their backs. Trent froze. He looked at the marshal and then looked down at the heavy steel handcuffs the officer was pulling from his tactical belt. The reality of the situation finally pierced through Trent, layers of corporate arrogance and rage. He was not a billionaire executive negotiating a minor legal dispute. He was a criminal suspect standing in front of federal law enforcement. Trent took a slow, terrified step backward. He raised his hands, palms out, and tried to put his executive mask back on. He smoothed the front of his tailored jacket and forced a weak smile. He told the marshal there was no need for handcuffs. He said he was a highly respected member of the corporate community, and he was more than happy to schedule a formal interview with his high-priced defense attorneys present. The federal marshal did not smile. He completely ignored Trent's request. He closed the distance, grabbed Trent's right arm, twisted it smoothly behind his back, and snapped the cold steel handcuff tightly around his wrist. Trent let out a sharp cry of pain and humiliation. He struggled for a brief second, but the marshal slammed him hard against the polished mahogany table, instantly subduing him. The marshal grabbed Trent's left arm and secured the second cuff. The sharp metallic clicking sound of the lock engaging echoed loudly in the silent boardroom. The second federal marshal approached Victoria. She did not struggle. She simply stood there, staring blankly at the floor, as her hands were pulled behind her back and cuffed. The reality of her failed Aspen villa and her impending federal prison sentence had completely short-circuited her brain. While the marshals were securing the prisoners, the young forensic accountant walked purposefully across the room. He bypassed the catered buffet and headed straight for the private executive office adjacent to the boardroom. He carried his silver briefcase and a stack of federal seizure warrants. He announced loudly to the room that the FBI was officially seizing all corporate servers, all personal computer terminals, and all digital communication devices within the Sterling headquarters. Trent was pressed flat against the mahogany table, his cheek resting against the polished wood. He looked incredibly small. His expensive navy blue suit was wrinkled and twisted. His perfectly styled hair was messy and soaked with cold sweat. He turned his head and looked directly at me. There was no anger left in his eyes. There was only absolute, total defeat. The man who had mocked me for being poor, the man who had laughed at me in the freezing rain, the man who had ordered his security guards to throw me onto the highway, was completely broken. The federal marshal pulled Trent off the table and turned him toward the heavy glass doors. Richard Sterling tried to step forward, his voice weak and trembling. He called out to his son, offering to call the best lawyers in the city. He promised they would fix this. But Richard's words were completely empty. Jeremiah had already confirmed that the banks would seize every single penny the Sterling family owned by tomorrow morning. They could not afford a public defender, let alone a high-priced corporate legal team. The marshals began marching Trent and Victoria across the plush carpet toward the executive elevators. The crowd of wealthy investors and politicians had completely vanished, leaving the boardroom feeling vast, empty, and entirely cold. As they walked past me, Victoria finally looked up. Her eyes met mine. She looked completely desperate. She opened her mouth as if she was going to beg for my forgiveness, as if she was going to try to remind me of the 10 years we had spent together. I did not give her the chance to speak. I looked at her with the exact same cold, clinical expression she had given me when she threw my suitcase onto the porch. I simply turned my head away, entirely dismissing her existence. The glass elevator doors slid open. The federal marshals pushed Trent and Victoria inside. Trent had hung low, his chin resting on his chest. His absolute arrogance was completely, totally shattered. The golden child of the Sterling real estate empire was taking his final ride down from the 50th floor in federal handcuffs. The heavy glass doors slid shut, sealing them inside. I stood in the silent boardroom, listening to the hum of the elevator descending. The champagne was completely flat. The caviar was untouched. The $100 million contract was shredded into useless pieces of garbage on the floor. Jeremiah Cobb walked over to the mahogany table and retrieved his heavy gold fountain pen. He slipped it neatly into his suit pocket and picked up his leather briefcase. He walked over to me and stood quietly for a moment, looking out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city skyline. He told me my father would be incredibly proud of how I handled myself today. I looked out at the city. I looked at the towering glass buildings and the bustling streets below. For the first time in my entire life, I did not feel intimidated by the massive wealth of the corporate world. I did not feel like an outsider looking in. I knew that every single inch of prime real estate spreading out below us belonged to my family. The empire Trent Sterling had built on, lies, arrogance, and manipulation, had completely crumbled into dust in a matter of 20 minutes. The foundation was finally clear. The land was finally mine. And I was absolutely ready to build something real. The heavy brass pendulum of the grandfather clock in Jeremiah Cobb's office swung back and forth with a slow, steady rhythm. It was exactly 11:58 on Friday morning. I was sitting in the same plush leather chair I had occupied 3 days ago when I was a broken homeless man with $14 to my name. Today, I was wearing a clean, tailored suit that Jeremiah had arranged for me. My posture was straight and my hands were perfectly steady. I was staring at the clock, waiting for the final 2 minutes to pass. Jeremiah sat across from me behind his massive oak desk. He was reviewing a thick stack of finalized legal documents. He looked up from his papers and checked his gold pocket watch, perfectly synchronizing it with the clock on the wall. He smiled a deep, genuine smile that reached his piercing blue eyes. He told me that the 50-year commercial lease executed by my late father was about to officially expire. I asked him if there was any possible way Victoria or her lawyers could reverse what was happening. I needed to be absolutely certain that the trap she built for me had completely closed around her own neck. Jeremiah leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. He explained the beautiful absolute irony of commercial family law. He told me that when Victoria filed the emergency expedited divorce on Monday, she was completely blinded by her own greed and arrogance. She wanted to divorce me instantly to protect herself from the fake $500,000 syndicate debt she had manufactured. In her desperate rush to legally sever our finances, she instructed her high-priced lawyers to include a blanket asset waiver. She formally and legally waived any and all rights to my past, present, or future inherited assets, because she wrongly assumed my father's land deeds were completely worthless pieces of paper. Jeremiah's voice resonated with profound satisfaction. He stated that the judge had signed Victoria's emergency petition yesterday afternoon. She got exactly what she wanted. She was granted an immediate legal separation, and she was completely insulated from my supposed gambling liabilities. But by forcing that exact legal insulation, she permanently surrendered any legal claim to the multi-billion-dollar real estate portfolio that was about to default into my name. The grandfather clock began to chime. The deep resonant bells echoed through the quiet office, marking the exact arrival of 12 o'clock noon. Jeremiah closed the legal folder on his desk. He looked at me with absolute respect. He formally congratulated me. He announced that as of this exact second, the 50-year master commercial lease was officially dead. The entire Sterling real estate empire no longer existed. The massive glass corporate headquarters, the luxury condominiums, and the sprawling, ultra-exclusive residential neighborhoods had completely legally reverted to the primary landowner. He slid a heavy silver keyring across the polished oak desk. It stopped perfectly in front of me. Jeremiah told me that my father had set up an independent legacy trust years ago, specifically to manage the land once the lease expired. He explained that I was now the sole primary director of the Blake Family Trust. The keys on the desk belonged to the first official company vehicle registered under my new corporate entity. Jeremiah said it was time for me to go inspect my newly acquired properties and tie up the absolute last loose end of my former life. I took the keys. The metal felt heavy and permanent in my hand. I stood up from the leather chair and buttoned my suit jacket. I thanked Jeremiah for everything he had done. He simply nodded and told me to give Victoria his absolute best regards. I took the private elevator down to the secure underground parking garage beneath Jeremiah Building. Sitting in the reserved executive spot was a brand new, immaculate, dark charcoal luxury sedan. It was not an obnoxious imported sports car like the one Trent Sterling drove. It was a vehicle that projected quiet, undeniable power. It was exactly the kind of car my father would have driven. I unlocked the doors and slid into the driver's seat. The interior smelled of rich, pristine leather. I gripped the steering wheel and took a deep breath, letting the reality of my new existence completely settle into my bones. 4 days ago, I was sleeping in a freezing 10-year-old sedan in a massive retail parking lot, trying to figure out how to survive. Today, I controlled the very ground that half the financial district was built upon. I started the engine. It hummed with a smooth, silent power. I pulled out of the parking garage and merged into the busy downtown traffic. The storm that had drenched the city all week had finally broken. The sky was a brilliant, piercing blue, and the bright midday sun reflected off the towering glass buildings. I drove slowly through the financial district, looking at the massive structures through entirely new eyes. I passed the towering black glass headquarters where Trent Sterling had been arrested yesterday. The building was completely surrounded by news vans and federal vehicles. The massive corporate logo bearing the Sterling name was already looking like a relic of a dead era. I did not stop. I had a much more personal destination in mind. I merged onto the highway and drove toward the wealthy suburbs. I was heading to the sprawling, ultra-exclusive gated community where Victoria and I had lived for the past 5 years. It was the exact same $2 million estate where she and her family had dragged me out the front doors and thrown my suitcase into the freezing rain. When I arrived at the grand stone entrance of the neighborhood, the heavy wrought iron security gates were closed. I pulled my charcoal sedan up to the guardhouse and rolled down my window. The private security guard stepped out of his booth, looking at my unfamiliar car with a strict, authoritative expression. He held up his hand and asked for my name and my resident identification. I did not give him a resident badge. Instead, I reached into my passenger seat and picked up a heavy, notarized legal document that Jeremiah had prepared for me. I handed the document through the window to the security guard. I told him in a very calm, polite voice that he should read the property mandate. I explained that I was not a resident attempting to access a home. I was the primary director of the Blake Family Trust, and I was the legal owner of the physical dirt sitting beneath this entire neighborhood, including the guardhouse he was currently occupying. The security guard looked incredibly confused. He scanned the dense legal text and saw the official county seals and the massive federal property transfer stamps. His eyes widened in absolute shock. He looked from the paper to my face, recognizing me as the man who used to live at the Sterling estate. He stammered a quick apology, handed the document back to me, and immediately pressed the button to open the heavy iron gates. I rolled up my window and drove through the entrance. The neighborhood was completely pristine, with massive manicured lawns, tall ancient oak trees, and enormous custom-built mansions. I navigated the familiar winding roads until I reached the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. Sitting at the top of a wide circular driveway was my former home. It was a gorgeous, sprawling piece of modern architecture with massive white columns and towering windows. But the scene on the driveway was absolute total chaos. There were 2 large moving trucks parked haphazardly on the pristine paver stones. A team of frantic movers was carrying expensive antique furniture and heavy boxes out of the front doors. Standing in the middle of the driveway, surrounded by expensive designer luggage, was Victoria. She looked absolutely horrendous. The flawless, poised woman who had orchestrated my destruction just a few days ago was completely gone. Her designer clothes looked rumpled and slept in. Her perfect hair was tied back in a messy, chaotic knot. She was holding a cell phone to her ear, screaming at someone on the other end of the line. I parked my dark charcoal sedan directly behind the moving trucks, blocking the driveway completely. I turned off the engine and just sat in the quiet, comfortable cabin watching her panic. Through the thick glass of my windshield, I could hear her frantic voice echoing across the manicured lawn. She was screaming at a bank representative, demanding to know why her premium credit cards were being declined by the moving company. She was yelling that she was Victoria Sterling and her family had millions of dollars. She sounded completely unhinged. The bank representative obviously hung up on her because Victoria let out a loud, frustrated shriek and threw her expensive cell phone directly onto the hard driveway. The screen shattered into dozens of pieces. She dropped her face into her hands and let out a dry, ragged sob. The banks had executed the cross-default orders perfectly. Because Richard and Diane Sterling had guaranteed Trent fraudulent corporate loans, the federal government had instantly frozen every single account associated with the Sterling family name. Victoria had no access to her trust fund. She had no access to her personal savings. She could not even afford to pay the movers to transport her stolen furniture. I opened the door of my sedan and stepped out into the warm afternoon sun. The sound of my car door closing echoed loudly, causing the movers to pause their work. Victoria snapped her head up. When she saw me standing there in my tailored suit, looking completely rested and incredibly powerful, her entire body froze. Her eyes went wide with a mixture of absolute shock, deep confusion, and rising terror. She looked at my new expensive car, and then she looked back at my face. She took a hesitant step forward. Her voice was weak and trembling, completely stripped of its usual arrogant poison. She asked me what I was doing here. She said I was legally barred from the property due to the divorce injunction. I reached inside my suit jacket and pulled out a thick, crisp manila envelope. I walked slowly up the circular driveway, my leather shoes making a steady, rhythmic sound against the stone pavers. I did not rush. I took my time, closing the distance between us, forcing her to stand there and endure my approach. I stopped exactly 3 feet in front of her. I looked at the dark circles under her eyes and the frantic, desperate energy radiating off her skin. I felt absolutely nothing for her. The love I had carried for 10 years had been completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, clinical sense of justice. I held the manila envelope out toward her. I told her I was not here to violate a divorce injunction. I told her I was here on official corporate business. Victoria stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. She refused to take it. She crossed her arms over her chest, reverting to her defensive, arrogant posture. She demanded to know what kind of game I was playing. She said her brother was going to destroy me as soon as he posted bail. I let out a short, quiet laugh. The sound made her flinch. I informed Victoria that Trent was not getting bail. I told her the federal magistrate had officially denied his release this morning due to the massive scale of the wire fraud and his status as a severe flight risk. I told her Trent was currently sitting in a federal holding cell and her parents were busy watching the bank foreclose on their country club estate. Victoria's face went completely pale. Her bottom lip began to tremble uncontrollably. She whispered that none of that was possible. She said they were the Sterling family and they were completely untouchable. I stepped closer, invading her personal space exactly the way Trent had done to me in the dining room just a few days ago. I pushed the manila envelope directly against her chest, forcing her to take it. I told her the Sterling family was nothing but a mirage. I explained that they had spent 50 years living in a castle built on rented dirt. I watched the horrible realization slowly creep into her eyes as my words finally penetrated her deep denial. I told her the 50-year commercial lease had officially expired at exactly 12 o'clock today. I stated that the Blake Family Trust now held absolute unencumbered ownership of every single inch of land her family had ever developed. Victoria's hands were shaking so violently she dropped the envelope. It hit the stone driveway and spilled open, revealing the crisp legal documents inside. The bold black letters printed across the top of the first page read, "Official Notice of Eviction." She stared down at the paper, her breath coming in short, rapid gasps. She looked up at me, her voice cracking with sheer panic. She pointed a trembling finger at the massive $2 million estate behind her. She screamed that she owned this house. She shouted that the divorce judge had legally awarded her this specific property in the emergency settlement yesterday. I kept my voice incredibly calm. I explained the beautiful, brutal reality of commercial property law. I told her she was absolutely correct. The judge did award her the physical structure of the house. She owned the bricks, the wood, and the glass. But I pointed down at my shoes. I told her I owned the dirt. I explained that because the master lease had expired, the physical structure of her $2 million estate was now considered an unauthorized encroachment on private commercial land. She had zero legal right to maintain a residential building on my property. I pointed down at the eviction notice resting on the driveway. I told her she had exactly 30 days to physically remove her house from my dirt. If she failed to relocate the massive 2-story mansion within 30 days, the physical structure would be legally classified as abandoned debris. Victoria let out a horrifying, desperate sound. She grabbed her head, pulling at her hair. She screamed, asking how she was supposed to move an entire brick mansion. She yelled that it was physically and financially impossible. She said the house was the only thing she had left in the entire world. I looked at her with completely dead eyes. I told her that was not my problem. I stepped past her and looked up at the massive white columns of the estate. I told her it was actually quite fortunate that she could not afford to move the house. I explained that I had already hired a commercial demolition crew. On the 31st day, I was bringing in heavy bulldozers to completely level the entire property. Victoria spun around, her face contorted in pure agony. She asked me why I was doing this. She begged me to tell her why I would destroy a perfect $2 million home just to leave an empty patch of grass. I turned back to face her. I told her the grass was not going to stay empty. I explained that I was using the massive liquid capital from my new corporate trust to clear this lot and construct a state-of-the-art community youth center. I told her I was going to take the ultimate monument to her family greed, vanity, and arrogance and crush it into gravel so I could build a place that actually helped people who were struggling to survive. The weight of the absolute total reversal finally crushed her completely. She realized she had absolutely no leverage left. She had no money, no family protection, and no home. She had thrown away a loyal husband to chase a fake fortune, and she had ended up completely destroying herself. Victoria's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the hard stone driveway, dropping to her knees. Her designer clothes scraped against the rough pavers. It was the exact same position I had been in when she threw my suitcase out into the freezing rain. The poetic justice of the moment was incredibly profound. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, ruining her skin. She reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab the fabric of my tailored suit pants. I took a quick step backward, refusing to let her touch me. She began to beg. Her voice was a pathetic, desperate whine. She pleaded with me to remember our 10 years together. She cried, saying she made a terrible mistake because Trent had pressured her. She swore she still loved me and begged me for a second chance. She promised she would be a better wife and that we could manage the new real estate empire together. She begged me not to throw her out into the street. I stood over her, looking down at the woman who had happily tried to send me to federal prison just a few days ago. I watched her weep and plead and offer me empty, toxic promises. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply looked at her and spoke the exact same words Trent had spoken to me when I was begging for my life. I told her she was out of time. I turned my back on her, leaving her sobbing on her knees in the middle of the driveway. I walked back to my charcoal luxury sedan. The movers had completely stopped working and were watching the entire scene in stunned silence. I opened my car door and slid into the comfortable, pristine leather seat. Victoria scrambled to her feet and ran toward my car. She slammed her hands against the passenger side window, screaming my name, begging me not to leave her alone with nothing. Her face was pressed against the glass, her expression twisted in absolute, terrifying desperation. I reached down to the center console and pressed the window control button. The thick, tinted acoustic glass smoothly and silently rolled up, sealing the cabin completely. The expensive soundproofing instantly cut off the sound of her frantic screaming. I put the car in gear and slowly reversed out of the driveway. I watched her in my rearview mirror as she fell back to her knees on the manicured lawn, weeping uncontrollably as the moving crew began packing up their trucks to leave her behind. I turned the steering wheel and drove back down the quiet, winding neighborhood streets. I drove past the massive mansions and the ancient oak trees. The gate guard waved respectfully as I exited the community and merged back onto the main highway. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light across the city skyline. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. The war was completely over. The Sterling Empire was dead. And I was driving toward a future that finally truly belonged to me. 6 months have passed since the heavy glass doors of that corporate boardroom closed on the Sterling family. It is strange how quickly a lie can be dismantled when it is finally dragged into the light. For 10 years I lived under the suffocating weight of their judgment. I believed I was the one who was failing. I believed I was the one who was not working hard enough or dreaming big enough. I let them convince me that my steady, reliable life was a symptom of weakness. But the last 6 months have proven that the tallest towers fall the fastest when they are built on a foundation of absolute fraud. The federal justice system does not care about country club memberships or expensive tailored suits. When the FBI forensic accountants finished tearing through Trent Sterling corporate servers, they found a mountain of evidence that went far beyond my forged gambling debt. Trent had been running a massive shell game for years. He was artificially inflating property values, moving non-existent funds between dummy corporations, and lying to federal tax agencies to keep his highly leveraged empire afloat. The fake syndicate debt he tried to pin on me was just the final desperate act of a man who knew the walls were closing in. I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse last week and watched Trent face the judge. He looked completely unrecognizable. He was no longer the golden child of the financial district. His hair was thinning, his face was gaunt, and he wore a standard-issue orange prison uniform instead of his custom navy blue suits. There were no wealthy international investors sitting behind him to offer their support. The corporate politicians who used to drink his expensive champagne were nowhere to be found. Trent stood entirely alone. The federal judge did not show him an ounce of mercy. She looked down from her bench and described his actions as a textbook example of predatory corporate greed. She pointed out that he did not just defraud massive financial institutions, but he actively attempted to destroy the life and reputation of his own brother-in-law to cover his tracks. When she handed down a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, Trent did not scream or argue. He simply dropped his head and stared at the floor, while the marshals placed the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists and led him out of the courtroom. He is going to spend the next decade and a half in a concrete cell, stripped of everything that made him feel superior to the rest of the world. The destruction of Trent Company triggered a total financial avalanche that completely buried Richard and Diane Sterling. Because they had proudly signed as personal guarantors on their son's massive corporate loans, The banks showed them absolutely no leniency. The cross-default notices were executed flawlessly. Within 2 weeks of the boardroom confrontation, the banks foreclosed on their $2 million estate. The luxury cars were repossessed. Their entire stock portfolio and their private retirement pensions were seized to satisfy the creditors. I heard through my legal team that Richard and Diane were forced to move into a tiny 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. It is the exact kind of modest working-class neighborhood they used to mock at their dinner parties. They have completely lost their social standing. The country club elite immediately revoked their memberships and erased their names from every exclusive guest list in the state. The people they used to call friends refused to return their phone calls because nobody wants to be associated with a family convicted of federal wire fraud. Richard and Diane spent their entire adult lives judging people by the size of their bank accounts, and now they are forced to live with the terrifying reality that their own accounts are permanently empty. They are entirely isolated, trapped in a cramped space with nothing but the bitter memories of the fake royalty they used to pretend they were. And then there is Victoria, my former wife, the woman who looked me in the eyes and called me a pathetic loser while throwing my suitcase into the freezing rain. Her downfall was perhaps the most poetic of them all. When Victoria filed the emergency expedited divorce petition, she demanded a complete separation of all assets to protect herself from my fabricated debts. She hired the most expensive, ruthless divorce lawyers in the city to ensure the paperwork was ironclad. But when the truth came out and my inherited land deeds were validated, she realized she had legally permanently locked herself out of a multi-billion-dollar fortune. She tried to reverse the divorce filing. She tried to claim she was manipulated. She tried everything she could to get her hands back into my pockets. But her high-priced lawyers quickly realized she had absolutely no money to pay them. The banks had frozen her trust fund. Her brother was in federal custody. Her parents were bankrupt. Victoria had racked up hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees trying to destroy me, and suddenly the very lawyers she hired turned their vicious collection tactics directly on her. They sued her for breach of contract and unpaid legal bills. The court garnished her wages and placed permanent liens on any future income she might earn. I drove past a massive retail shopping center a few weeks ago checking on a commercial lease property that my trust now manages. I walked into a large department store to speak with the regional manager about some upcoming renovations. As I walked through the brightly lit aisles, I saw a woman folding cheap synthetic sweaters on a display table. She was wearing a rigid polyester company uniform and a plastic name tag. Her shoulders were slumped and she looked incredibly tired. It was Victoria. The woman who used to complain that our beautiful home was not luxurious enough was now working a minimum wage retail job just to survive. She spends 8 hours a day standing on her feet serving the exact same working-class people she used to look down upon. Every single dollar she earns beyond her basic living expenses is automatically garnished by the court to pay off the lawyers she hired to ruin my life. She built an elaborate trap to throw me into poverty, and she walked right into it herself. I stood near the front of the store and watched her for a moment. She dropped a stack of sweaters and let out a heavy, exhausted sigh as she bent down to pick them up. I did not feel the need to walk over and gloat. I did not need to say a single word to her. The reality of her life was a far harsher punishment than anything I could ever say. I simply turned around, walked out the glass doors, and went back to my work. My life looks completely different now, but not in the way most people would expect. When you suddenly take control of a real estate empire worth billions of dollars, the world expects you to change. The media and the financial advisors expected me to instantly buy a massive private yacht, a fleet of imported sports cars, and a sprawling mansion on a private island. They expected me to step right into the arrogant, flashy shoes that Trent Sterling had left behind. But they did not understand who I am. They did not understand the blood that runs in my veins. My father did not build his legacy by screaming for attention or buying things just to make other people jealous. My father was a quiet, patient man who understood that true wealth is not about what you can show off to the world. It is about what you can build for the future. I still drive the same reliable charcoal gray sedan that Jeremiah Cobb handed me the keys to 6 months ago. It is safe, comfortable, and it does exactly what I need it to do. I did not buy a massive empty mansion. I purchased a modest, beautiful piece of property on the edge of the city surrounded by tall, ancient pine trees. It is a quiet place where I can sit on the back porch, drink my coffee in the morning, and listen to the wind moving through the branches. There are no grand chandeliers and no imported marble floors. It feels like a real home. It feels like peace. The real work. The work that gets me out of bed every single morning happens on the land itself. I have spent the last 6 months completely restructuring the Blake Family Trust. We are no longer leasing ground to predatory corporate developers who want to build empty luxury towers for billionaires. I took the massive tract of land where the Sterling estate used to sit, the exact place where I was thrown out in the rain, and I followed through on my promise. The $2 million mansion Victoria loved so much was completely demolished. We brought in the heavy bulldozers and crushed the brick and glass into dust. We cleared the lot and poured a completely new foundation. I am standing on that foundation almost every single day. We are building a massive state-of-the-art community youth center and a sustainable housing project for families who are trying to get back on their feet. The center will have indoor basketball courts, a massive public library, technical training classrooms, and a safe, reliable daycare facility for working parents. I walk through the construction site wearing a hard hat and work boots, talking with the foreman and the carpenters. I smell the fresh-cut lumber and the wet concrete. I watch the steel beams going up into the sky, and I know that this building is not a monument to my ego. It is a monument to my father. It is a place that will actually serve the community instead of draining it. I have taken the remaining commercial properties in the downtown sector and implemented strict ethical leasing standards. We are offering heavily subsidized rent to local small business owners, independent medical clinics, and public service organizations. I am using the immense power of my fatherland to create steady, reliable growth that benefits the people who actually work for a living. I am surrounded by a team of brilliant ethical lawyers and financial planners, managed by Jeremiah Cobb, who ensure that every single decision we make honors the integrity of the Blake family name. Sometimes late at night, when the house is completely quiet, I go into my home office and unlock my desk drawer. I pull out the heavy, rusty brass key with the numbers 814 stamped on the side. I run my thumb over the cold metal and think about the journey that brought me here. I think about the Sunday dinner when I thought my life was completely over. I remember the freezing rain soaking through my clothes, the absolute terror of having $0 in my bank account, and the profound, heartbreaking betrayal of looking into my wife's eyes and seeing nothing but calculated greed. I remember how easy it would have been to just give up to sign the settlement papers and let them erase me completely. But this rusty key reminds me that patience and integrity are the most powerful weapons a man can wield. My father knew that the Sterling family was completely hollow. He knew that their arrogance would eventually make them blind to their own vulnerabilities. He did not leave me a stack of cash that could be stolen. He left me the absolute truth, and he trusted me to be strong enough to carry it when the time was right. I did not have to compromise my morals to defeat Trent and Victoria. I did not have to become a monster to slay the monsters. I just had to stand my ground, hold on to my dignity, and let their own toxic greed completely consume them. They chose the illusion of power. They chose the flashy cars, the expensive champagne, and the fake prestige of a stolen empire. And in the end, the illusion vanished, leaving them with absolutely nothing. I chose the truth. I chose the quiet, steady path of building something real. I have my peace. I have my dignity. I have a legacy that I control with absolute integrity. I no longer feel like a guest in my own life. I am exactly the man my father raised me to be, and no amount of fake debt or corporate intimidation could ever take that away from me. I sit alone in my quiet home office long after the sun has set. The only light comes from the small brass desk lamp illuminating the surface of my heavy wooden desk. Resting right in the center of the polished wood is the old rusted key with the numbers 814 stamped into its side. I pick it up and feel the cold, rough metal against my skin. 6 months have passed since Jeremiah Cobb slid this exact key across a sticky diner table and changed the entire trajectory of my existence. 6 months since I was a broken homeless man with $14 in my pocket and a forged $500,000 bounty on my head. Looking at the key now, I realize it is not just a piece of metal. It is a profound lesson in human nature. My father was a man of very few words, but he possessed a deep, terrifying understanding of how the world actually worked. He knew that modern society is entirely obsessed with the illusion of wealth. We live in a culture that worships the loudest person in the room. We are taught to respect the man wearing the $5,000 tailored suit and driving the imported sports car. We are conditioned to believe that success is defined by how much noise you can make and how much space you can dominate. My father completely rejected that philosophy. He believed in quiet, steady growth. He believed in the kind of strength that does not need to announce itself to be real. When he placed his legacy inside that dark metal safe deposit box, he did not leave me liquid cash or a flashy digital portfolio. He left me a rusty, ugly key because he knew exactly how the Sterling family operated. He knew Richard and Diane judged human worth purely by external appearances. He knew Trent was a corporate predator who built his entire life on leverage and intimidation. And most painfully, he knew that Victoria, my own wife, was infected by the exact same toxic greed. My father understood that if they saw a shiny gold key or a massive bank account, they would recognize its value and steal it immediately. But a rusted old piece of brass meant absolutely nothing to them. They ignored it because it lacked prestige. Their own shallow vanity made them completely blind to the very thing that held the power to destroy them. They applied that exact same shallow judgment to me. For 10 years, I was a loyal husband and a dedicated employee. I worked 50-hour weeks managing regional supply chains. I paid the bills, I fixed things around the house, and I tried to be the solid, reliable foundation that Victoria claimed she wanted. But to the Sterling family, honest hard work was simply a sign of a lack of ambition. Because I did not brag about my investments at Sunday dinners, because I did not bully waiters or scream at contractors, they decided I was weak. They mistook my patience for complacency. They mistook my kindness for stupidity. Trent Sterling thought he was a king. He spent his entire adult life aggressively acquiring debt to build a glass empire that he never truly owned. He lived every single day on the razor edge of total financial collapse, relying on fake confidence to keep the banks from calling his loans. That kind of lifestyle breeds a very specific kind of paranoia. Trent had to crush anyone who did not fit into his false narrative. He looked at me and saw a man who was perfectly content without millions of dollars, and it absolutely terrified him. He had to frame me for a massive illegal syndicate debt because he needed an excuse to feel superior. He needed to turn me into a degenerate criminal so he could justify stealing my family land deeds to save his own failing corporate merger. And Victoria. The betrayal from my wife is a wound that took months to finally close. When you spend a decade with someone, you share your deepest fears and your quietest moments. You build a life based on the assumption that they will protect your blind spots. Victoria took that profound trust and weaponized it. She watched me sleep. She ate the meals I cooked, and she smiled at my family while secretly planning to leave me completely destitute in the streets. She traded a faithful husband for the illusion of a luxury villa in Aspen that she will never get to see. She let her family toxic obsession with status completely devour her soul. But grief eventually gives way to clarity. Over the last 6 months, I have learned that true power has absolutely nothing to do with cruelty or volume. True power is not about ruining other people to make yourself feel tall. True power is standing in the freezing rain staring at a forged document designed to end your life and refusing to let it break you. True power is walking into a massive executive boardroom filled with hostile billionaires and quietly, calmly dismantling their entire universe without ever raising your voice. I do not live the way Trent Sterling lived. I did not take my massive, newly acquired wealth and purchase a massive yacht or a private jet. I did not buy a sprawling, isolated mansion to hide away from the world. The wealth I inherited from my father was not meant to be hoarded or used to intimidate people. It was meant to be a tool for actual sustainable growth. The Blake Family Trust now operates with strict, unyielding ethical standards. We are taking the land that the Sterlings used for exclusionary luxury development, and we are returning it to the community. The $2 million estate where Victoria threw my suitcase out the front door is completely gone. We brought in the heavy machinery and tore it down to the bare dirt. In its place, we are building a massive state-of-the-art community youth center. It is going to have educational facilities, safe recreation areas, and programs designed to help young people who actually need a genuine second chance. Every single time I drive past that construction site and see the steel beams rising from the ground, I feel an overwhelming sense of profound peace. I took a monument to greed and turned it into a foundation for hope. We are offering subsidized commercial leases to small business owners who were previously priced out of the city by Trent predatory corporate tactics. We are building sustainable, affordable housing for working families. I have surrounded myself with a team of brilliant, dedicated professionals led by Jeremiah Cobb. They ensure that every single contract we sign and every project we fund adheres to the quiet, steady principles my father believed in. We do not operate with leverage, and we do not operate with smoke and mirrors. We pay in cash, we honor our agreements, and we sleep incredibly well at night. People occasionally ask me if I feel any lingering resentment or guilt regarding the fate of the Sterling family. They ask if it bothers me that Richard and Diane are living in a cramped two-bedroom apartment completely shunned by their former country club elite friends. They ask if I feel bad that the people who used to dictate the social hierarchy of the entire city are now completely isolated and forgotten. They ask if I take any joy in knowing that Trent Sterling is currently wearing a standard-issue uniform in a federal penitentiary serving a 15-year sentence for massive corporate wire fraud. The honest answer is that I feel absolutely nothing for them. I do not feel guilt because I did not force them to make their choices. I did not force Trent to illegally forge my signature on offshore bank accounts. I did not force Richard and Diane to proudly guarantee toxic corporate loans with their personal pensions. I did not force Victoria to abandon her marriage and commit perjury in a federal family court. I simply survived the trap they built for me. The Sterling family destroyed themselves. Their own arrogance blinded them to the reality that you cannot build a permanent kingdom on a foundation of lies and stolen dirt. They were so obsessed with moving fast and acquiring more that they completely forgot to look down and see whose land they were standing on. They were entirely consumed by the modern disease of instant gratification. They wanted the money, the power, and the prestige right now, regardless of who they had to crush to get it. My father taught me that the universe operates on a much longer timeline. He waited decades to see his justice served. He endured the disrespect of arrogant men because he knew his paperwork was flawless and his claim was absolute. He passed that exact same patience down to me. When they locked my bank accounts and took my car, I did not panic. When they fired me from my job, I did not resort to violence. I walked into the storm, I found the rusty key, and I waited for the exact, precise moment to let the truth step into the light. Lies are incredibly expensive to maintain. You have to constantly manipulate people, borrow money, and look over your shoulder to keep a lie alive. The truth costs absolutely nothing. The truth is completely patient. It can sit in a dark metal box in the basement of a legacy bank for 40 years completely unbothered by the noise and the chaos of the world above. And when the truth is finally revealed, it cuts through the strongest lies like a sharp blade through wet paper. I look at the rusty key on my desk one last time before placing it safely back into the drawer. It is a permanent reminder of where I came from and the man I fought so hard to become. The storm is completely over. The corporate towers are under new ethical management. The people who tried to bury me are the ones who ended up completely buried by the weight of their own criminal greed. I have my dignity, I have my freedom, and I have a legacy that I am incredibly proud to pass on to the next generation. I proved that you do not need to become a monster to defeat one. You just need to hold your ground, and let the truth do the work. They threw me out for a fake debt, but they ended up paying the ultimate price. Sometimes the best way to destroy your enemies is just to let them keep digging their own graves. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to remember that patience always outlasts greed, and subscribe to the channel for more stories where the truth always wins.